Hey there, welcome back to Outlaw Icons, where history's darkest whispers come alive. Tonight, we're not just talking about a gangster. We're stepping into the world of Sam Giancana. Some called him Mooney. Others knew him as the Chicago boss who controlled votes, Vegas, and lives with a single word. But the world remembers him as something else entirely. The mobster who played with presidents, courted Hollywood, and struck secret deals with the CIA. A man who went from the back streets of Chicago's Little Italy to the smoky casinos of Vegas and into the shadows of the White House itself. And then, just like that, he was found in his own basement, 7 bullets in his body, taking his secrets to the grave. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It never stops amazing me how this little underworld of ours stretches across time zones and countries. And hey, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We've got stories coming that you won't want to miss. All right, let the noise of the day fade away. Settle in and follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. The basement was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears like a warning. A pan sat on the stove, sausage simmering in its own fat, the scent clinging to the air. It was June of 1975, and Sam Giancana, once the king of Chicago's underworld, the man who had dined with presidents and whispered with spies, stood barefoot on the cool tile floor of his own home. He was 67 years old, but still carried himself with the posture of a man who thought he could bend fate with a phone call. That night, fate came knocking in the form of 7 silenced bullets. The killer entered through the back, slipping into the Oak Park house as if it belonged to him. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't sloppy. Whoever came for Giancana knew the locks, knew the layout, knew the man's habits. He had cooked late at night before, often alone, humming under his breath, a little ritual after returning from exile in Mexico. The neighbors heard nothing but the faint hiss of frying meat. Then came the muffled cracks of a .22 caliber pistol fitted with a suppressor. Each shot quick, methodical, almost gentle if you didn't know what it meant. 7 rounds. 3 to the head. 4 to the neck. In mob language, that was punctuation. Not just murder. A message. When the police arrived, the scene was strange in its intimacy. A man who had lived at the center of violence, politics, and betrayal now sprawled beside a frying pan. No grand mansion. No casino backroom. Just the basement kitchen of his modest suburban home, stained with blood. His killers left nothing behind but speculation. Was it his old outfit comrades silencing him before he could testify before Congress about CIA assassination plots against Fidel Castro? Or was it the government itself, erasing a liability who knew too much about the dark marriage between organized crime and national security? The answers died with him. To understand how a man ends his story like that, alone, unarmed, 7 bullets in the shadows, you have to rewind. You have to walk back through the smoke-filled rooms where Sam Giancana ruled like a ghost king. Chicago in the 1920s was a city built on contradiction. Immigrants filled cramped tenements, factory whistles screamed at dawn, and the streets dripped with both opportunity and despair. In those narrow alleys of Little Italy, young Salvatore Giancana learned the rule of survival. You either belong to someone, or you belong to no one at all. And in that neighborhood, belonging meant the mob. Sam was a wiry, hot-blooded boy. They called him Mooney behind his back, a word for crazy, because his temper snapped fast, his violence faster. He joined the 42 gang, a crew of reckless teenagers who stole cars, hijacked trucks, and terrorized their corner of the city. For most, it was a way to prove themselves. For Giancana, it was an audition. The Chicago outfit, the empire left behind by Al Capone, watched these kids closely. The best of them graduated into the major leagues of crime. Giancana was not just good. He was fearless. Driving getaway cars during Prohibition taught him nerves of steel. When bullets ripped through the night, Sam kept his foot steady on the gas, never flinching. That kind of ice in the veins made him useful. Soon, he wasn't just a driver. He was an enforcer, a man who made debts disappear and silence permanent. Violence was his grammar, and he spoke it fluently. By the 1930s, Giancana was already climbing, mentored by outfit bosses who saw in him not just brutality but calculation. He could kill a man and then charm a room 10 minutes later, grinning like the violence had never happened. That duality, ruthless and charismatic, was the core of Sam Giancana. But his rise was not just about fists and guns. It was about money. Giancana took control of the numbers racket, the illegal lottery played in poor neighborhoods, especially among black communities in Chicago's South Side. For pennies a day, thousands played their hopes. For Giancana, those pennies stacked into mountains. By consolidating the racket, by bribing cops and intimidating rivals, he created a river of cash that never stopped flowing. And money, in the outfit, was power. The more he controlled, the closer he sat to the throne. By the 1950s, that throne was practically his. Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca, old Capone lieutenants, stepped back from the spotlight. They preferred a younger, brasher face to take the heat. Sam was perfect. He was flashy, loud, and unpredictable enough to keep the press fascinated and the FBI busy, while the Real Old Guard remained untouchable in the shadows. But Giancana wasn't content to be a decoy. He wanted to be king in truth. And for a time, he was. Under his reign, the outfit reached into Las Vegas casinos, skimming millions off the tables. He rubbed shoulders with Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and the glittering Rat Pack. Hollywood stars sat at his tables. Politicians came calling, eager for Chicago's vote machine. Giancana lived like a movie star, parading girlfriends, wearing tailored suits, strutting into nightclubs where every eye turned his way. To outsiders, he seemed untouchable, half mob boss, half celebrity. But behind the glamour, his ambitions carried him into darker corridors that led straight into the heart of American power. It was the Cold War. Washington was obsessed with Fidel Castro, the bearded revolutionary who had kicked out the mob from Havana's casinos and threatened U.S. interests 90 miles from Florida. The CIA wanted him dead, and they needed men who knew how to make people disappear. Who better than the Mafia? The agency reached out, carefully, through intermediaries. Robert Maheu, a former FBI man turned private operator, became the bridge. And who stood on the other side of that bridge? Sam Giancana. Imagine the irony. A U.S. government agency, sworn to uphold the law, sliding envelopes to a gangster whose hands were drenched in blood. Giancana met with CIA contacts in hotel rooms and bars, discussing poison pills, Cuban contacts, and assassination logistics. It was espionage wrapped in gangster slang. The same man who ordered hits on Chicago rivals now plotted with American intelligence to topple a foreign leader. It was a marriage of convenience, but also a reflection of Giancana's world. For him, crime and politics were never separate. They were just different tables in the same casino. At the same time, whispers grew louder that Giancana had helped swing the 1960 election. Chicago, with its dense immigrant wards and notorious ballot boxes, delivered crucial votes for John F. Kennedy. Some claimed Sam's machine was the deciding factor. If true, the irony burned deep. The Kennedys owed him, yet Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, declared war on the mob almost immediately. Federal indictments, wiretaps, surveillance. Giancana became one of the most hunted men in America. The very family he helped into power now painted a target on his back. Still, Giancana strutted. He boasted of affairs with women tied to Hollywood and politics, the most infamous rumor connecting him to Marilyn Monroe herself. Whether truth or myth, it added to his mystique. The gangster tangled in America's royal family of the 60s. But with each scandal, with each headline, he alienated allies inside the outfit. Men like Accardo saw his showmanship as a liability. Mob rule thrived on silence and shadows. Giancana was turning it into theater. And theater attracts both audiences and enemies. By the mid-60s, the pressure was unbearable. Giancana fled Chicago for exile in Mexico. He lived in Cuernavaca, in a villa with guards at the gates and eyes always on the door. But even there, he couldn't escape. Mexican authorities eventually handed him back to the United States. When he returned in 1974, he was older, heavier, and under constant government scrutiny. His days of champagne and rat-pack glamour were gone. He cooked alone now, sometimes at midnight, as if trying to fill the silence. The Senate wanted him to testify. The church committee was digging into CIA assassination plots, and Giancana's name was scrawled across too many files. Subpoenas loomed. He was supposed to appear and answer questions that could unravel the darkest secrets of the Cold War. Secrets that tied mobsters to presidents, spies to killers. Whether he would have talked, no one knows. Maybe he still believed silence was the only shield left. Maybe he thought he could bluff his way through, as he had so many times before. But someone, somewhere, wasn't willing to take that chance. And so, in the quiet of his Oak Park basement, as the sausage sizzled and grease popped in the pan, the past caught up with him. The figure with the pistol stepped from the shadows. 7 shots, each one closing a chapter, each one erasing a secret. The neighbors never heard it. The pan kept hissing. And Sam Giancana, the man who thought he could dance between mobsters, movie stars, presidents, and spies, collapsed in a kitchen of ordinary tile. The aftermath left only questions. Who ordered it? The outfit, tired of his noise and fearing betrayal? The CIA, tying off loose ends before the Senate hearings? Or both, in a grim partnership, just as before? The man who had blurred the line between crime and government ended his life in the ultimate blur, murdered by hands we still cannot name. This was not just the end of a man. It was the end of an era. An era where mobsters whispered in the ears of presidents, where spies shook hands with killers, where the lines between democracy and deception blurred under neon lights and cigar smoke. To understand that ending, we must peel back the layers. We must see where Sam Giancana came from, how he rose, how he seduced power, and how he finally lost everything. Because in the mob, there are no retirements, no golden sunsets, only endings like this. Quick, silent, and full of shadows. And as we leave the basement, blood cooling on the tile, one question lingers in the silence. Who really killed Sam Giancana, and why? The summer heat pressed down on Chicago's Little Italy like a weight, thick with the smell of bread from corner bakeries and the metallic tang of factory smoke. On one of those streets in 1908, a boy named Salvatore Giancana first opened his eyes. No one looking at the small, sickly infant could have guessed the scale of the shadow he would one day cast. But poverty has a way of chiseling children into survivors, and Little Italy in the early 20th century was a crucible. Dirty alleys, crowded tenements, and endless hunger shaping futures long before dreams ever had a chance. The streets were narrow, lined with brick row houses crammed with immigrant families who carried more scars than possessions. Italians, Poles, Irish, each fighting for scraps of dignity in a city that wanted their labor but sneered at their presence. Kids learned early that you had to be tough or be trampled. Young Salvatore grew up watching men shuffle home from factories with broken backs, their pay envelopes already spoken for by landlords and grocers. His father, a Sicilian immigrant, tried to instill discipline, but discipline didn't put food on the table. What put food on the table was nerve, and Giancana had plenty of it. By the time he was 10, Salvatore had already earned a reputation among neighborhood kids for being quick to anger and quicker with his fists. They laughed at his nickname, Mooney, short for Mooney, a slang for crazy, but the laughter usually ended with bruises. The boy seemed to thrive on being underestimated, turning mockery into fuel. He learned to fight in alleys where there were no referees, just cobblestones and fists. That fire, dangerous as it seemed in a child, made him impossible to ignore. Police reports from the era show his first brushes with the law came early. Petty theft, street fights, vandalism. Nothing serious by mob standards, but enough to mark him. In neighborhoods like Little Italy, the police weren't guardians, they were predators. Bribes bought safety. Intimidation bought silence. And for boys like Salvatore, the badge was just another uniform of power to be resisted or manipulated. The line between cop and crook blurred quickly when both took your money and left you bleeding. That's the world Giancana grew up in, a world where authority was just another racket. By adolescence, Salvatore was drawn into the orbit of the 42 gang. They weren't yet the legends they would become, just a pack of reckless teenagers with a taste for stolen cars and easy money. But for Giancana, the gang was more than camaraderie. It was a family that offered belonging, a surrogate brotherhood for boys whose real homes were filled with shouting and empty cupboards. The 42 gang taught him the art of hijacking trucks, boosting cars, and outsmarting cops who underestimated them as dumb kids. But these weren't dumb kids. They were apprentices, unknowingly training for careers in the Chicago outfit. He proved himself behind the wheel. Driving a stolen Ford through the night with police headlights chasing him, he held the wheel steady, unblinking, even when bullets shattered the air around him. The other boys swore he never even flinched. In a world where fear was currency, Giancana showed he could afford to spend none. And in the mob's arithmetic, that made him valuable. His temper, though, was legendary even then. He once flipped a card table during a dispute over winnings, lunging across at boys twice his size. Another time, he put a rival into the hospital for mocking his father's accent. These weren't mindless rages. They were performances. He was sending messages: insult me, and you pay. Cross me, and you bleed. The neighborhood learned quickly. The laughter stopped. Respect, or at least fear, took its place. But it wasn't just violence that defined him. There was cunning too. He learned how to run the numbers racket, an illegal lottery game played by poor families hoping to escape poverty. For them, a few cents was a gamble for a miracle. For Giancana, those pennies added up into fortunes. He understood that crime wasn't just about intimidation. It was about systems, about knowing how to turn desperation into dependable profit. He collected slips, kept ledgers, and made sure winners were paid promptly. Reliability, even in crime, builds loyalty. People began to trust him with their money, even as they feared him with their lives. This was the paradox of Sam Giancana taking shape, the boy who could terrify with one hand and reassure with the other. He was a thug, but also a businessman, a bully, but also a provider. In neighborhoods where the government turned a blind eye, the mob filled the vacuum. To many families, Salvatore wasn't a criminal. He was stability. He was opportunity. He was hope wrapped in menace. And yet, that duality came at a cost. Each step deeper into gang life pulled him further from the chance at anything else. His father had dreamed of honest labor, of his son making good in America. Instead, he watched the boy vanish into alleys at night, returning with pockets full of stolen cash and bruised knuckles. Pride and fear wrestled inside the old man's eyes. He had wanted his son to be strong, to stand tall in a city that spat on Italians. But strength had grown into something darker, and now the boy was no longer his to guide. As the 1920s roared into being, Chicago became the capital of bootleg booze and bloodshed. Prohibition transformed petty gangsters into empires overnight. The outfit, what remained of Capone's machine, was always on the lookout for soldiers who didn't blink when guns went off. Salvatore Giancana, with his cold nerves and restless ambition, was no longer a street kid. He was being groomed for something far bigger. The 42 gang wasn't just a gang anymore. It was a recruiting pool, and Sam Giancana was one of its brightest prospects. But with opportunity came danger. Rivals circled, cops stalked, allies betrayed. Every handshake hit a knife. By the time Giancana was in his early 20s, he had already survived more violence than most men did in a lifetime. And yet, he seemed almost energized by it, as if chaos was oxygen. People began to whisper that Mooney wasn't just crazy. He was destined. He carried himself like someone who knew the city would one day kneel to him. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. The boy who had once fought in alleys for scraps was now standing at the threshold of the outfit, ready to cross into the major leagues of organized crime. The next move would either cement him as a rising star or bury him as just another name lost in the blood-soaked streets of Chicago. The dice were already rolling, and the city was about to find out just how far Salvatore Giancana was willing to go. The sound of tires screeching across wet pavement echoed through the narrow Chicago streets. A Ford roared past a corner bakery, headlights slashing the night, and behind the wheel sat a wiry teenager with his jaw set tight and his eyes locked forward. That boy was Salvatore, Sam, Giancana, and in that moment, he wasn't just running from cops. He was racing headlong into a life that would never let him go. The 42 gang was his crucible, and every chase, every punch, every stolen nickel hardened him into the man who would one day rule Chicago. The 42 gang wasn't some playground club. It was a pack of wolves disguised as neighborhood boys, each one desperate to claw his way out of poverty. They were teenagers, but their crimes already looked like the work of professionals: car thefts, extortion, armed robberies. They prowled the west side of Chicago like restless ghosts, never still, never satisfied. The name itself carried a kind of swagger, though no one agreed on where it came from. Some said it was a joke about how many kids filled the crew. Others claimed it was the number of police reports with their fingerprints on them. Whatever the truth, the number carried weight, and when people in Little Italy whispered it, they did so with a mix of fear and awe. Giancana found belonging here. These weren't kids trying to escape the street. They were kids who owned it. With them, he could shed the weight of being an immigrant's son, mocked for his accent, pushed aside by the system. In the 42 gang, fists spoke louder than birth certificates. Sam, with his quick hands and quicker temper, fit like a blade into its sheath. He wasn't the biggest, but he was relentless. If someone crossed him, he came back harder, faster, more determined. That's why the boys called him Mooney. Not just crazy, possessed. Their crimes weren't subtle. A bakery delivery truck rumbled too slowly down an alley. Gone by nightfall, its bread and pies sold for pennies on the street. A shopkeeper refused to pay protection. Windows shattered before dawn. They weren't businessmen. Not yet. They were chaos in motion. But hidden inside that chaos was training. Without realizing it, they were learning the very skills that kept the outfit alive: discipline, loyalty, violence on command. For Sam, the car became his weapon of choice. Behind the wheel, he was ice. Police chased, sirens wailed, bullets cracked through the air, and his hands never trembled. Witnesses swore he could guide a car through alleyways no wider than his outstretched arms, dodging horses, wagons, even crowds of terrified pedestrians, all without blinking. He wasn't just a driver. He was a surgeon with a steering wheel. In a city where alcohol was outlawed but desire for it never died, that skill made him invaluable. Bootleggers needed drivers who could escape. The outfit noticed. Yet, for all the adrenaline and money, the gang's life was soaked in violence. Knives flashed in alleys. Guns barked in the night. Sometimes, the bodies that turned up weren't enemies, but old friends. Betrayal lurked behind every deal. A wrong look. A careless word. One boy beaten to death for skimming too much. Another disappeared, his family left with silence. Each time, Giancana watched, listened, absorbed. He wasn't just surviving. He was studying. The cops, of course, were never far behind. Arrests came and went like bad weather. Sometimes a judge lectured. Sometimes a beating landed in a police basement. But in Chicago, money spoke louder than handcuffs. Bribes flowed, cases vanished, and the 42 boys walked free. They learned early that the law wasn't blind, it was for sale. And Sam, sharp as he was, tucked that lesson deep into his bones. Still, Giancana wasn't invincible. There were nights he stumbled home bloodied, his father shaking his head, his mother praying in Sicilian whispers. For a moment, you could almost see the boy beneath the mask, tired and raw. But by the next morning, he was back on the street, the fire in his eyes burning hotter. Each scrape only seemed to confirm what he already believed, that the world respected fear, not honesty. The 42 gang grew notorious. Newspapers painted them as juvenile delinquents, but on the streets, people knew better. They weren't kids anymore. They were soldiers in training, and the outfit was watching. The old bosses, the men who once served Al Capone, kept their eyes on crews like this. They understood that empires didn't last without new blood. And among all the reckless faces of the 42, one stood out. The boy who never flinched. The boy who turned car chases into ballet. The boy with madness in his grin and calculation in his eyes. Sam craved their notice. Every job, every fight, every risk, he wanted it to matter. He wasn't built for small scores or petty triumphs. He wanted a seat at the table where real power was dealt. And soon, he would get it. But ambition comes with enemies. Rival gangs saw the 42 boys as pests, gnats buzzing around the real action. Battles broke out. Turf fights over who controlled which corner, which bar, which slice of Chicago's illegal trade. Sometimes it was fists, sometimes knives, sometimes a body dumped in a vacant lot with no name, no future. Sam watched his friends bleed, burying the laughter they once shared under cold dirt. He learned to stop asking why. In the mob, questions were luxuries. The police, too, stepped up their war. Crackdowns hit the neighborhoods. Raids sent boys scattering like pigeons. But no matter how many were arrested, the gang reassembled, bolder than before. Fear had become their fuel. The more the city tried to crush them, the more Giancana seemed to thrive. He was already thinking like a boss. Pressure, he believed, was just another test. And he had no intention of failing. By the late 1920s, the 42 gang wasn't just a nuisance, it was a pipeline. The outfit had begun plucking the sharpest, the coldest, the most disciplined from its ranks. It was like a draft into a darker league. And Sam was first in line. His reputation as a wheelman, his fire in street fights, his cold stare under interrogation, all of it painted him as something more than another thug. He was ready for the big leagues. But readiness didn't guarantee survival. The transition from petty gangster to outfit soldier was like stepping into a casino where the stakes were life and death. One wrong move, one careless word, and the house always won. Sam knew it, yet he hungered for it anyway. The 42 gang had been his family, his training ground, his first taste of blood and loyalty. But now it was only a stepping stone. On one quiet night, as the rest of the crew celebrated another stolen score, Sam stood apart, staring down a dark alley as if he could already see the future. Behind him, laughter. Before him, shadows. And in those shadows waited the outfit, the empire that could make him a king or bury him before anyone remembered his name. The choice was no longer his. The path had already been set. The 42 gang was ending, not with a bang, but with a transformation. Its best sons would vanish into the outfit, absorbed into the machine. Sam Giancana was next. He didn't just want it. He was built for it. And as he prepared to take that step, one question lingered like smoke in the air. Would his ambition carry him to the throne, or straight into an early grave? The night was split open by gunfire. A black sedan roared down Cicero Avenue, bullets chewing holes through its side panels, sparks flying as slugs ricocheted off steel. Inside, clutching the wheel with white-knuckled precision, sat Sam Giancana. He was no longer just a neighborhood punk with a wild temper. He was now driving for the outfit, and in Chicago's criminal empire, a wheelman wasn't just a driver, he was the lifeline. If he panicked, everyone inside the car died. If he stayed calm, they lived to collect their cut. And Sam, he stayed calm. That night sealed his reputation. By the late 1920s, the 42 gang had scattered into history, its best soldiers absorbed into the outfit. Frank Nitti, Capone's successor and the man charged with keeping the empire intact while Big Al served prison time, knew how to spot talent. He didn't need another loud thug with an itchy trigger finger. He needed someone who could drive a car like it was an extension of his own nerves, someone with ice in his veins and fire in his eyes. Giancana fit the mold perfectly. Chicago was a battlefield back then. The Volstead Act had outlawed liquor, but the city drank more than ever. Bootleggers ran convoys through alleys and highways, fighting over routes as if they were oil fields. Trucks carrying barrels of whiskey were guarded like armored cars, and the men chasing them were as ruthless as wolves. To drive one of those trucks was to gamble with your life. The outfit needed drivers who didn't crack under fire. Sam proved again and again that he could glide through chaos as if it were choreography. But he wasn't just a wheelman. He had graduated from being the boy who laughed at danger to the man who carried it in his pocket. When a rival crew refused to pay tribute, Sam didn't argue. He pulled up outside their bar, walked in with a smile, and left the place in ruin. Windows shattered, bottles burst, men crawled on broken glass. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The violence spoke for him. The outfit rewarded loyalty with opportunity, and Giancana grabbed it with both hands. Soon, he was sitting in backrooms with lieutenants who had once served Capone himself. Men like Nitti taught him the real business of crime. How to collect without drawing too much heat, how to grease the right palms, how to make a threat sound like an invitation. Sam watched closely, memorizing every gesture, every silence, every trick. He learned that power wasn't just about pulling the trigger. It was about making sure the right people looked the other way afterward. Still, his temper sometimes flared like the old days. Stories spread of Giancana exploding in rages, flipping tables, slamming fists against walls. Yet those same stories always ended with him getting the last word. His unpredictability made him dangerous, but it also made him respected. In a world where reputation could save your life, Mooney was carving out one of his own. People knew better than to test how far his madness would go. During this time, the outfit was evolving. Prohibition wasn't just about smuggling liquor anymore. It was about control, gambling, prostitution, unions, politics. Every racket fed the machine. Giancana was assigned to enforce collections in the numbers racket, and here he proved himself again. Collectors who came up short suddenly found their excuses didn't matter. He made sure the money flowed like water. And when the outfit tested him with bigger responsibilities, he delivered. Fear, after all, was a currency, and Sam printed it in abundance. One of his most infamous early roles came in the dirty business of contract hits. The outfit had a way of recycling talent. Wheelmen became shooters, shooters became enforcers, and enforcers became bosses. Giancana wasn't the most feared hitman, but he was trusted to get things done. A man was marked, Sam handled it. A witness was wavering. Sam persuaded him never to take the stand. He wasn't flashy about it. He was efficient, cold, surgical, and the money kept rolling. Every week, envelopes fat with cash passed through his hands. For the first time, Giancana lived with a kind of swagger. Tailored suits, new cars, late nights in clubs where jazz bands played until dawn. Women whispered his name, half in fear, half in desire. To the outside world, he was becoming somebody. But inside, he knew he was still just climbing the ladder, one rung at a time, and above him loomed men who could crush him with a nod. The danger never left. Chicago police were cracking down harder than ever, raiding warehouses, smashing barrels, arresting low-level runners by the dozens. But Sam stayed a step ahead. Each time he was hauled in, he walked free. Witnesses suddenly forgot faces. Judges suddenly lost interest. Files vanished like smoke. He had entered the circle where law became suggestion, not rule. For a young man from Little Italy, that was intoxicating. Yet, he never forgot the lesson of fear. In one story whispered for years, Giancana pulled a trembling bookmaker into an alley after he failed to pay his share. Instead of shouting, Sam leaned in close, spoke quietly, almost kindly, and then pressed a gun barrel to the man's lips. No shot fired, just the sound of the hammer clicking back. The bookmaker paid the next day. That was Sam's style. Violence not always unleashed, but promised with chilling certainty. Frank Nitti trusted him, but trust in the outfit was always conditional. You were useful until you weren't. Sam knew this. He studied the older bosses like a hawk, learning their weaknesses, their tells, their patterns of loyalty. He wasn't content to stay an enforcer forever. Power was a drug, and Giancana was already addicted. Each job he completed without flinching, each order he carried out with ruthless efficiency, was a brick in the empire he planned to build for himself. But ambition cast shadows. Enemies noticed. Rivals whispered. Even allies began to wonder if Mooney's fire burned too bright, too fast. In the world of the outfit, ambition was both a ticket upward and a target painted on your back. And Giancana was stepping onto a stage where one misstep meant disappearing forever. Still, in those years of the late 1920s and early 30s, he was unstoppable. The boy from Little Italy, once mocked for being poor and angry, was now feared as one of the outfit's most reliable enforcers. He could drive, he could collect, he could kill, and he could smile while doing it. Chicago was his arena, and he was no longer just a player. He was a rising star. but stars that rise too quickly attract attention, from cops, from rivals, and from the men above him who didn't like seeing a subordinate enjoy too much applause. The streets that had once felt like home were now a chessboard, each move dangerous, each ally temporary. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another storm was already forming. For Sam Giancana, the role of enforcer was only the beginning. The outfit was watching, testing, waiting to see if he would survive the crucible long enough to join the inner circle. He had proven himself behind the wheel. He had proven himself with his fists, with his gun, with his ability to make men tremble. But in the mob, proving yourself never ended. It was a cycle without mercy. And as the city braced for the Great Depression, with hunger gnawing at the streets and rival gangs clawing for scraps, Giancana's next test would arrive not with a handshake, but with a command that could either cement his rise or seal his fate. The room went silent when Sam Giancana's temper broke. One moment he was leaning back in his chair, cigarette balanced between his fingers, a sly grin playing at the corners of his mouth. The next, the chair was overturned, the table flipped, and a glass shattered against the wall. His men froze, eyes darting between each other, waiting to see who the storm would fall on. That unpredictability, the way he could turn from charm to fury in an instant, was what earned him the name Mooney. Crazy, reckless, dangerous. The nickname wasn't given in jest. It was a warning. Chicago in the 1930s was a city stitched together with fear. The Great Depression had gripped the nation, and where legitimate businesses failed, the outfit thrived. Breadlines stretched around blocks, but in backrooms the cash never stopped flowing. Illegal gambling, bootlegging, loan sharking, all of it turned the outfit's pockets heavy. And standing in the middle of it was Giancana, no longer just a driver or small-time enforcer, but a man trusted to guard territory and enforce discipline. The violence was relentless. Giancana didn't shy away from it. He embraced it as the currency of power. When a bookmaker skimmed too much off the top, Sam handled it personally. He didn't delegate. He wanted the fear in the man's eyes to be his creation, a kind of calling card. Stories spread fast. A grocer who refused to pay protection was found beaten half to death in his own store, his shelves smashed, his money drawer empty. A loan shark who crossed the wrong line disappeared altogether, his body surfacing weeks later in a canal. None of these events were ever pinned directly on Giancana, but everyone knew. And in that world, reputation was worth more than gold. He had a knack for making the unpredictable into strategy. If men thought he was crazy, they hesitated. If they hesitated, they lost. And Sam never hesitated. That's what made him so useful to the outfit bosses. Frank Nitti relied on him not only to carry out orders, but to send a message. Sam was the embodiment of controlled chaos, a reminder to rivals and allies alike that the outfit didn't just punish disobedience, it obliterated it. As the 30s rolled on, his responsibilities grew. He wasn't just settling street scores anymore. He was managing entire crews, directing hits, deciding who lived and who didn't. It was a chilling kind of promotion. In the corporate world, management means supervising desks and schedules. In the mob, management meant lives on your ledger. And Sam handled it like he had been born for it. Cold, efficient, without hesitation. But violence alone doesn't keep an empire running. Giancana understood that fear needed to be balanced with loyalty. After brutalizing a man, he was known to quietly slip money to the victim's widow, ensuring her silence and even her gratitude. He'd buy Christmas presents for children whose fathers he had crippled. It wasn't kindness. It was strategy. People whispered that Mooney had a strange heart, a twisted code. He wasn't just a monster. He was a provider, in his own bloody way. That contradiction made him even harder to predict. The outfit valued him because he could be both the knife and the hand offering bread. He became indispensable. During the turbulent years of the Depression and then the war, when rival gangs tried to muscle into Chicago, it was Giancana who held the line. His crews patrolled neighborhoods like soldiers, making sure the outfit's grip never loosened. Anyone foolish enough to test that grip vanished, swallowed by alleys and rivers. And each disappearance tightened his legend. The nickname Mooney grew heavier with each passing year. To outsiders, it meant instability. To insiders, it meant ruthlessness disguised as instability. Nobody could tell if his rages were genuine or calculated. That made him dangerous in a way that pure brutality never could. You couldn't prepare for him. You couldn't predict his next move. Men feared the possibility more than the act itself. That was power. By the early 1940s, his role had expanded even further. He wasn't just the outfit's enforcer anymore. He was becoming its tactician. Hits didn't happen without his say. Collections didn't flow without his oversight. His crews didn't just protect the outfit's interests, they expanded them. Gambling dens, brothels, union rackets. Each became part of the empire he guarded like a general on a battlefield. The outfit bosses noticed. At the same time, federal pressure was mounting. The FBI was beginning to turn its eye toward Chicago, and Sam found himself on wiretaps, under surveillance, shadowed by agents. But here, too, his unpredictability worked in his favor. He never stuck to a routine. He changed cars, routes, even restaurants at random. To catch him, you had to anticipate him, and that was nearly impossible. It was like trying to trap smoke. Still, the life was wearing. Nights filled with blood and whiskey blurred into years. Friends disappeared. Rivals were buried. Even allies fell silent, their loyalty expiring the moment it became inconvenient. Sam carried all of it in stride, never showing doubt, never showing weakness. But those close enough saw flickers, the long stares, the restless pacing, the moments when the weight of it all pressed down. His rage wasn't just a weapon. It was also a release, a way to keep from being swallowed whole by the violence he orchestrated. The outfit rewarded him with wealth, though not the kind of wealth splashed across newspapers later in his life. In these years, it was modest compared to the millions he would one day skim from Vegas. But for a boy from Little Italy who had once gone hungry, the tailored suits, the new cars, the thick roll of bills in his pocket, it was proof he had clawed his way to the top of the pile. And he wasn't done climbing. The war years added another layer. With so many men overseas, opportunities at home multiplied. Black markets thrived. Giancana capitalized, overseeing smuggling operations that kept cash pouring into outfit coffers. He had gone from a reckless driver to a man commanding networks. And the bosses trusted him because he delivered results without hesitation. Yet, even as he rose, shadows lengthened. Ambition this bright didn't go unnoticed. Other enforcers, other rising stars, began to see Giancana not as an ally, but as a rival. Tensions simmered. Whispers grew. Was Mooney too unpredictable? Too dangerous even for the outfit? Some wondered if his violent streak would one day turn inward, if he'd start breaking tables meant to be kept whole. But Sam never slowed. Each act of violence seemed to propel him higher, as if bloodshed was the engine of his ambition. He embraced the nickname meant to mock him. Mooney wasn't an insult anymore. It was his crown. He wore it with pride, a badge that said he was too dangerous to be ignored, too valuable to be discarded. By the late 1940s, Sam Giancana had carved out his place in the outfit hierarchy. No longer just a soldier. No longer just a driver. He was a man whose name carried weight in both whispers and shouts. Mooney was feared, respected, envied. And in the world of organized crime, that combination was lethal. Yet, for all his victories, one truth remained constant. The higher you climbed in the outfit, the thinner the air became. Allies turned brittle. Trust became fragile. And the bosses above him, men like Tony Accardo, watched closely. They rewarded loyalty, but they never forgot ambition. One misstep, one outburst at the wrong time, could end the ascent as quickly as it began. Sam Giancana had built his rise through violence, unpredictability, and fear. But fear cuts both ways. It protected him, and it isolated him. As he stared into the smoky mirrors of Chicago's backrooms, he must have wondered how long before the same weapon he wielded so well was turned against him. The next chapter of his story wouldn't answer that question. It would only sharpen it. Because soon, Mooney wasn't just going to enforce the outfit's will. He was going to embody it. And the city of Chicago was about to learn what it meant when a man who thrived on chaos began to rule. The coins clinked against the counter, Small wagers placed by hands that trembled with both hope and desperation. Pennies, nickels, dimes. On scraps of paper, numbers were scribbled, dreams reduced to 3 digits. For Chicago's poor, the numbers game, known as the policy wheel, wasn't just a gamble. It was the fantasy of escape. And for Sam Giancana, it was the gold mine that would cement his rise. By the time the 1930s gave way to the 40s, Giancana had turned those pennies into an empire, weaving gambling into the veins of the city itself. The numbers racket wasn't born with him, but under his watch it grew into something colossal. In black neighborhoods across Chicago's South Side, the policy wheel was more than just a lottery. It was culture. Every morning, barbershops, cafes, and street corners buzzed with talk of what numbers might hit. Housewives, janitors, laborers, all tossed in their coins, hoping for a miracle. For the outfit, it was steady money, flowing in by the thousands every single day. But steady wasn't enough for Sam. He wanted it bigger. He wanted it locked down. At first, he moved like a shadow, watching, studying, calculating. Independent operators ran their wheels with pride, often respected community figures. But respect meant nothing to the outfit. Sam began sending his collectors, men with hard stares and quicker fists. Pay up, or pay the price. At first, there was resistance. Shopkeepers hesitated. Old-timers spat on the idea of handing their livelihood to a hot-headed gangster. And then one by one, resistance broke. A smashed storefront here. A bloody warning there. Soon, the message was clear. The numbers didn't belong to the neighborhood anymore. They belonged to Giancana. But Sam wasn't foolish enough to just steal. He understood something most mobsters didn't. Optics mattered. He let some of the old operators stay, keeping them as figureheads while his men skimmed the profits. He gave small gifts back to the community, just enough to keep mouths shut and loyalty simmering. The neighborhood still saw familiar faces, but the power had shifted. Behind the curtain, it was Mooney pulling the strings. The money was staggering. Nickels turned into stacks of cash that filled bags, then safes, then rooms. Estimates suggested that by the 1940s, the racket alone was pulling in millions each year. Millions at a time when most families struggled to keep food on the table. That kind of cash didn't just buy suits and cars. It bought influence. Politicians suddenly softened when Sam's name was mentioned. Police captains turned their heads, their silence purchased in neat envelopes. Even church leaders found donations arriving anonymously, their sermons suddenly steering clear of gambling sins. Giancana was no longer just an enforcer. He was an administrator of vice, a businessman in a dark suit. He managed collectors, bookkeepers, and enforcers like a CEO running a corporation. Only this corporation thrived on fear, blood, and control. And yet, people still played. Because for the poor, the numbers weren't about who ran the racket. They were about that slim, glimmering chance of freedom. Sam knew the irony. He knew he was bleeding communities dry while dangling hope in front of them. But he didn't care. In his mind, he was providing a service. The government had abandoned these neighborhoods. He gave them excitement, possibility, a shot at beating the odds. And in return, they gave him wealth beyond imagination. He told himself it was fair. Deep down, he must have known it was exploitation dressed up as generosity. But morality had no seat at his table. The expansion didn't stop with policy wheels. Giancana funneled his profits into gambling dens, backroom casinos, and betting parlors. Dice games rattled under low light. Roulette wheels spun in smoky rooms. Card tables hummed with tension as men wagered away paychecks in minutes. Every roll, every flip, every spin whispered money into Sam's coffers. The outfit was already wealthy, but Giancana's operation was turning steady profit into a roaring river. The police raids came, but they were theater. A few tables overturned, a few arrests made, but nothing that truly hurt. The next night, games resumed as if nothing happened. The bribes ensured that. Cash slid under doors, drinks raised in quiet thanks, and the law moved on. Chicago had become a carnival of corruption, and Giancana was its ringmaster. His nickname, Mooney, followed him into this empire. Dealers whispered it when he walked into rooms, his reputation arriving before he did. He was unpredictable, yes, but that was part of the fear that kept everything running. Collectors never dared skim. Managers never dared cheat. Everyone knew Mooney could turn smiles into screams in a heartbeat. And yet, he laughed with them, drank with them, sometimes even sang with them. It was a strange charisma, the kind that blurred cruelty with charm. Men feared him, but they also wanted to be near him. That paradox made him magnetic. The success of the numbers racket propelled him further up the outfit's hierarchy. He was no longer a pawn. He was becoming a knight, a piece that moved with power, shaping the game. His bosses, Ricca, Accardo, Nitti, saw his value. They gave him room to grow, but they watched carefully. Ambition this bright could not be ignored. It had to be managed, controlled, sometimes clipped. Sam knew that too. He played the part of the loyal lieutenant, but inside he was already rehearsing for the role of boss. Yet, the more he rose, the more blood trailed behind him. Independent operators who refused to bow vanished. One was found in a ditch outside Joliet, his hands bound, his body mutilated as a warning. Another simply disappeared, his family left with silence and whispers. Each elimination strengthened Sam's hold. And with each elimination, the fear around his name grew colder, harder. By the time the 40s settled in, Giancana was overseeing an empire within the empire. Gambling was his kingdom, and the outfit let him rule it because he delivered. Millions kept flowing upward, into the hands of bosses who trusted results more than restraint. And Sam delivered results with brutal consistency. But success bred enemies. Other crews within the outfit envied his profits, resented his swagger. Rivals outside the outfit plotted ways to claw back territory. Federal investigators began whispering his name in Washington. And even within his own circle, men who laughed with him by night sometimes schemed against him by morning. It was the curse of power in organized crime. The higher you climbed, the more hands reached for your throat. Sam didn't flinch. He doubled down. Each threat was an opportunity to demonstrate control. He handled disputes the way he always had, through violence, intimidation, or charm, whichever the moment required. Sometimes all three in quick succession. He had mastered the art of unpredictability, keeping everyone around him guessing. And when people guess, they hesitate. And when they hesitate, Sam won. The policy wheel, once a neighborhood game of chance, had become a pillar of organized crime under Giancana's grip. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about empire. It was about proving to his bosses, to his rivals, and to himself that he was destined for more than just enforcing someone else's rules. He was destined to right them. But in the shadows of his success, a new kind of pressure was forming. War was reshaping the world, soldiers leaving for battlefields overseas while Chicago kept humming with vice. And soon, the outfit's ambitions would stretch beyond numbers and dice. They would look to Vegas, to Cuba, to politics itself. And Sam Giancana, with his pockets full of gambling cash and his reputation carved in fear, would be right in the middle of it. He thought he controlled the game. But the truth was, the game was growing bigger than him. And somewhere ahead, hidden in the smoke of the future, the very empire he built was about to demand more than just blood and money. It would demand secrets, alliances, and risks that reached far beyond Chicago. The dice were still rolling, but the stakes were about to change. And Sam Giancana was about to find himself gambling with forces far more dangerous than any policy wheel could ever be. The restaurant was dim, heavy with cigar smoke and the clink of glasses. In the corner, where the noise of the room seemed to fade, Sam Giancana waited. He had been summoned, and summons like this were never casual. The men he was about to face weren't just bosses. They were the remnants of Capone's empire, the architects of the outfit's survival. Tony Accardo, Paul Ricca. The names carried weight that could crush or elevate, depending on how they chose to use it. When Sam finally stood in front of them, he wasn't just an ambitious soldier anymore. He was a candidate being measured for something greater. Accardo, known as Joe Batters, had the eyes of a man who had seen everything and forgotten nothing. He was quiet, cautious, the kind of leader who preferred shadows to headlines. Paul the waiter, Ricca, by contrast, was refined, almost aristocratic in demeanor, his voice soft but firm. Together, they were the steady hands guiding the outfit after Capone's era of chaos. They valued profit over spectacle, patience over recklessness. And yet, in Sam Giancana, they saw potential. It wasn't his charm that drew them, though he had plenty of that. It wasn't even his violence, though his reputation as Mooney preceded him. It was his discipline. For all the fury in his temper, Giancana knew when to shut up, when to listen, when to bide his time. In a world where loose talk buried men faster than bullets, that kind of restraint was priceless. The meetings were quiet, private. A dinner in a back room, a drive through the suburbs, a hushed conversation behind closed doors. In those moments, Sam learned from masters. Ricardo taught him subtlety, the art of running an empire so quietly that the law barely noticed. Rica taught him diplomacy, the way to bend politicians and businessmen without ever raising a fist. These weren't lessons in brutality. They were lessons in power. Sam listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He absorbed. And slowly, he began to shape himself into something more than just an enforcer. He was learning to think like a boss. But make no mistake, trust in the outfit was never unconditional. Ricardo and Rico weren't grooming Giancana out of kindness. They saw utility. They saw someone who could front the outfit's operations, take the heat from law enforcement, keep the spotlight away from themselves. If he succeeded, they profited. If he failed, he absorbed the fall. For Sam, it was both an opportunity and a trap. But ambition blinded him to the danger. He began to spend more time with the old guard, sitting in meetings where decisions shaped the city itself. Union leaders bent their heads in those rooms, agreeing to strikes or concessions with a nod from the bosses. Judges and aldermen appeared like supplicants, their pockets filled before they left. And Sam, once a boy running stolen cars through alleys, now sat at the edge of that table, watching, waiting, absorbing. He wanted to be at the center, but for now, the edge was enough. It was here that Giancana mastered the art of patience. He had always been quick with violence, but now he learned the long game. A lone shark who resisted didn't need to be killed immediately. Sometimes he needed to be squeezed slowly, until he bled out willingly. A politician who hesitated on a favor didn't need a threat. He needed a promise, a future guarantee that tied him tighter to the outfit's hand. Violence was still there, but it became a scalpel, not a hammer. The trust grew. Ricardo began sending him to oversee larger operations, gambling houses, smuggling routes, political negotiations. Rica tested his ability to keep cool under pressure, sending him into rooms where one wrong word could ignite war. Sam passed these tests with a mix of charm and menace. He was Mooney, yes, but Mooney had matured. The fury was still there, but it was now wrapped in silk. Not everyone welcomed his rise. Older outfit members grumbled, resentful of his swagger and his growing closeness with the bosses. They whispered that he was too reckless, too loud, too eager for attention. And in truth, they weren't entirely wrong. Sam enjoyed being noticed. He liked the flash of tailored suits, the roar of expensive cars, the attention of women. Ricardo and Rica tolerated it for now, but they warned him quietly, glamour draws heat, and heat draws ruin. If he wanted to climb higher, he needed to balance his hunger with discretion. For a time, he listened. But ambition is a stubborn flame. The more power he tasted, the more he wanted. By the 1940s, the outfit had fully transitioned from Capone's brawling street army into a business empire. Gambling, unions, politics, it was all controlled with a quiet efficiency that rivaled corporations. Giancana was being groomed to inherit that system, to carry it forward into a new generation. Ricardo and Rico weren't immortal. They needed successors, and Sam was proving himself every day. Still, shadows lingered. The FBI was watching. Rival crews sniffed for weakness. And even within the outfit, alliances were fragile. Ricardo and Rica trusted him, but trust in that world was always provisional, always conditional. One slip, one sign of betrayal, and the same men who groomed him could bury him. Sam understood this, but he believed he could outmaneuver it. He had survived poverty, gangs, violence, betrayal. He believed he was destined for more. And with the old guard watching, guiding, and slowly lifting him, his belief hardened into certainty. But certainty in the mob is a dangerous thing. The same men who raise you up can just as easily decide you've climbed too high. And as Giancana tightened his bond with Ricardo and Ricca, he was unknowingly stepping into a role that would one day place him at the very top and place a target squarely on his back. The whispers began before the papers made it official. A new man was running Chicago, not from a prison cell, not from exile, but from the very heart of the outfit itself. The year was the early 1950s, and the quiet power of Tony Ricardo was receding into the background. He hadn't fallen. He hadn't been pushed. He had simply stepped aside, preferring to govern from the shadows, leaving the day-to-day to a man who had clawed his way up from alleys and number slips. That man was Sam Giancana, and with his rise came both glory and danger, because unlike Ricardo, Sam didn't live in the shadows. He basked in the light, and light, in this world, was deadly. The moment was subtle. There was no coronation, no dramatic announcement. But within the outfit, men knew. Orders now came stamped with Sam's voice. Disputes were settled at his table. Territory was divided with his nod. Even those who doubted his discipline recognized his influence. He was the de facto boss, a man whose authority didn't need a title to be real. And in Chicago, that authority stretched like a net across every racket. Gambling, loans, unions, politics, and the ever-flowing river of cash from Las Vegas. For Sam, it was a dream fulfilled. Every brutal alley fight, every late-night drive under fire, every calculated hit had led to this. He wasn't just Mooney anymore. He was the face of the outfit, the man at the helm of an empire worth millions. But with the throne came exposure. Where Ricardo had been invisible, Giancana was flamboyant. He liked to be seen, to be admired. Tailored suits, flashy cars, nights in Vegas surrounded by singers and starlets. Sam lived as if the world should notice him. And notice him it did. The national press circled like hawks. Stories of Chicago's new mob king filled headlines. His name spread beyond the city, whispered in New York, mentioned in Washington. The FBI scribbled his name into reports, a priority target. To them, Giancana wasn't just another gangster. He was a symbol that organized crime hadn't died with Capone, but had evolved into something more sophisticated, more dangerous, and infinitely harder to kill. Inside the outfit, not everyone was pleased. Some resented his swagger, his taste for attention. The old guard preferred silence. Sam preferred applause. To them, his style was reckless. To him, it was power. He believed that fear and fascination were two sides of the same coin, and he spent that coin freely. Crowds noticed when he entered a room. Women flocked to his side. Politicians pretended not to see him, then called his men after midnight. He was a boss in the old sense, but he was also something new, part gangster, part celebrity. His reign brought expansion. Gambling revenues soared, with outfit-controlled casinos in Vegas funneling untold sums back to Chicago. Union rackets tightened their grip, ensuring no construction, no trucking, no shipping moved without a cut sliding into outfit pockets. The numbers racket remained strong, and new ventures opened in Latin America, stretching Chicago's influence far beyond state lines. Under Sam, the outfit was richer than ever, more connected than ever, and yet more exposed than ever. The attention brought headaches. The FBI launched deeper investigations. Wiretaps sprouted like weeds. Informants whispered into government ears. Newspapers ran exposes, splashing Giancana's face across front pages. To the public, it was spectacle. To the outfit, it was risk. Ricardo had avoided this kind of spotlight for decades. Sam seemed to welcome it. And each time his picture appeared, each time his name was mentioned in the same breath as Sinatra or Vegas, allies grew uneasy. Still, his charisma kept him untouchable for a while. He could explode in rages, terrifying his lieutenants, and then an hour later charm them into laughter over drinks. He could terrify a rival with a stare, then win over a politician with a smile. It was a balancing act, dangerous and thrilling, like walking a tightrope over open fire. The higher he walked, the more eyes watched. And the more eyes watched, the more likely someone was waiting for him to fall. The 50s were also a time of change in America. The Cold War deepened, paranoia spread, and the government began cracking down harder on organized crime. The Kefauver hearings dragged mob bosses into the national spotlight, forcing them to sit before cameras and senators. For men like Ricardo, this was humiliation to be avoided at all costs. For Giancana, it was a stage he thought he could control. But control in Washington was a different beast than control in Chicago. Senators weren't gamblers. Agents weren't bartenders. The rules had shifted. Sam adapted by leaning into what he knew best, relationships. He deepened ties with entertainers, using men like Sinatra to open doors into Hollywood and Vegas. He wove his charm into politics, nudging candidates, buying influence, ensuring the outfit's vote machine delivered results. And in return, those results made him indispensable. But the more he climbed, the more isolated he became. Old allies muttered that he was drawing too much attention. Younger men admired him, imitating his style, craving his approval. Federal agents followed him relentlessly, documenting his every move. Even the CIA began to take notice, not just because of who he was, but because of what he could offer. To them, Giancana wasn't just a mobster. He was a man with international connections, someone who could be useful in a shadow war against communism. The irony was sharp. A boy from Little Italy who once stole bread from shop windows was now being considered as a partner in secret operations with the United States government. His reign as boss had opened doors he never could have imagined. But it also placed him under scrutiny that no gangster should ever welcome. The spotlight was intoxicating. But in the world of organized crime, it was also lethal. Sam believed he could balance it, that he could straddle the line between celebrity and kingpin without consequence. Yet, in every shadowed backroom, the whispers grew louder. Was Mooney's way of ruling sustainable? Or was he walking the outfit toward disaster? He sat in his Oak Park home, late at night, smoking in silence while the city around him pulsed with life. To the outside world, he was untouchable. To himself, he must have known that every throne is a trap, every crown a target. His reign had begun with swagger, with ambition fulfilled. But power in the outfit never came without a cost. And as the 50s closed, that cost was beginning to reveal itself. The FBI was circling tighter. Rivals were watching closely. Politicians were whispering in safer rooms. And somewhere, in the corridors of Washington, agents in dark suits were writing his name into files that would change his life forever. The man who had finally become king was about to discover that every empire carries a shadow. And in Sam Giancana's case, that shadow stretched far beyond Chicago, into Havana, into Hollywood, and into the White House itself. The desert glowed with neon, an oasis of light, and sin rising from sand and silence. Las Vegas in the 1950s wasn't just a city. It was a promise, a mirage built on gambling, music, and spectacle. Tourists saw glamour, champagne towers, chorus girls, tuxedoed crooners under spotlight. What they didn't see was the other hand moving beneath the table. That hand belonged to the outfit, and at its head sat Sam Giancana. For him, Vegas wasn't a vacation. It was a gold mine, and he intended to carve his initials into its foundations. The scheme was simple on paper, but elegant in execution. Outfit-controlled casinos in Vegas raked in millions from tourists who never looked beyond the dice. The house always won. And when the house belonged to the mob, the winnings didn't just pay performers or light bills. They were skimmed. Bundles of cash slipped past official ledgers, counted in hidden rooms, stuffed into suitcases, and flown back to Chicago. It was theft in plain sight, and it worked because everyone who could stop it was already bought, silenced, or too scared to ask questions. Sam didn't invent the skim, but under his reign it became an art form. Skimming wasn't robbery, it was precision engineering. If a casino made $100,000 in a weekend, the official books might show 80. The missing 20, untraceable, unreported, fed the outfit's coffers. And when you multiply that trick across multiple casinos, night after night, the numbers grew staggering. The outfit's fortune swelled, and Giancana sat at the center of the river of money flowing through the desert. But Vegas wasn't just about cash. It was about image. And no one understood that better than Giancana. He leveraged friendships with Hollywood stars to cement his grip. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, the Rat Pack, men who defined cool in America, were his companions, his front-row entertainment, his allies. When Sinatra crooned under the glittering lights of the sands, Sam wasn't just in the audience. He was part of the show, a silent partner whose presence was both glamorous and terrifying. To politicians and businessmen, those friendships gave Giancana credibility. To the public, they gave him mystique. He wasn't just another gangster lurking in shadows. He was the man who drank with Sinatra, who laughed with Dean Martin, who sat beside movie stars at midnight shows. That aura made him untouchable for a while. Few dared to question him when he could turn from mob boss to celebrity guest in the blink of an eye. Yet behind the glamour, fear ran deep. Casino employees knew that skimming wasn't optional. Dealers and pit bosses followed orders without complaint, aware that mistakes could mean more than termination. They could mean disappearance. Hotel managers greeted Sam with forced smiles, hiding their terror under crisp tuxedos. Even stars who partied with him understood that beneath the laughter, he was still Mooney, still the man whose temper could turn a dinner into a death sentence. For Giancana, Vegas was intoxicating. The desert air carried a promise of endless expansion. The outfit had always thrived in Chicago, but Vegas was something new. Legalized gambling, blessed by the state, but quietly owned by the mob. It was legitimacy with a criminal's grin. Sam reveled in it. He strutted through casinos as if they were extensions of his living room, his bodyguards trailing behind, his mistresses on his arm. He lived like a king because in Vegas, he was one. The money was staggering. Millions skimmed each year, funneled back to Chicago and distributed among the outfit hierarchy. But Giancana didn't just hoard it. He invested it into more casinos, into real estate, into businesses that blurred the line between legal and illegal. With each investment, his influence grew wider, his empire more stable. At least on the surface. Because success has a cost. The more money that flowed, the more attention it drew. Federal investigators began to notice irregularities. Reporters sniffed at rumors. And within the outfit, jealousies festered. Other bosses resented Sam's flamboyance, his eagerness to be seen with celebrities, his taste for the spotlight. They remembered Accardo's quiet rule and wondered if Giancana's style was sustainable or if it was inviting disaster. Sam ignored the doubts. He was intoxicated by the glow of neon, by the sense that he had transcended the limitations of a gangster. He was no longer the boy from Little Italy, no longer just Mooney. He was a figure of power who mingled with presidents and performers alike. In Vegas, he found proof that his ambition had been justified all along. But ambition carries shadows. The FBI intensified surveillance. Wiretaps picked up his name, his voice, his deals. Senators spoke of organized crime with a new urgency, pointing to Vegas as the mob's glittering front. And even as Sam raised a glass of champagne under the lights, he must have felt the weight of eyes on him, watching, recording, waiting. For the casino workers, the fear was constant. They smiled for tourists, joked with celebrities, but in back rooms, they counted money under the gaze of men who would kill them for a single slip. For the stars who shared Sam's table, the relationship was equally double-edged. Friendship with him meant access, fame, opportunity. It also meant danger. Whispers swirled around Hollywood about his temper, his demands, his control. Yet still they came. Because power, like light, draws everything toward it, even when it burns. The outfit, too, prospered. With Giancana at the helm, the flow of money was steady, reliable. Chicago's bosses grew richer, their influence stretching from Nevada to Washington. Politicians who accepted campaign donations looked the other way. Judges who received envelopes found cases mysteriously collapsing. Vegas wasn't just entertainment. It was leverage, and Sam wielded it like a blade hidden in a velvet glove. But the more he expanded, the more he tied his fate to a city built on illusion. Vegas thrived on appearances, on the idea that luck could change with a single spin. Giancana, in his own way, lived that illusion. He believed he could gamble with exposure, that he could be both mob boss and celebrity without consequence. But luck, like neon, flickers eventually. And when it goes dark, all that's left is shadow. The desert had given him everything: wealth, influence, glamour. But it also drew eyes from every direction. Federal agents, jealous rivals, ambitious politicians, all focused on the man who believed he could skim millions in plain sight. And as the spotlight grew hotter, Sam Giancana discovered that Vegas was not just an empire. It was also a stage. And every stage demands an ending. The dice kept rolling, the roulette wheels kept spinning, the neon kept glowing. But in the back rooms, where suitcases of cash were counted under dim light, the tension was building. The very system that made him king could just as easily unmake him. And in the distance, beyond the glitter and glamour, storms were gathering. Storms that would drag Giancana out of the casinos and into a web of politics, espionage, and betrayal far more dangerous than any game of chance. The nightclub lights dimmed, and a single spotlight cut through the smoke. Frank Sinatra stepped up to the microphone, his voice curling through the room like velvet. The crowd leaned forward, lost in the song, unaware of the man sitting just a few feet away at a reserved table. Sam Giancana wasn't there for the music. He was there for the man singing it. To the public, Sinatra was the voice of America, the crown jewel of the Rat Pack. To Giancana, he was something else entirely: an ally, a bridge, a door to worlds that gangsters usually only dreamed of entering. Their friendship didn't happen by accident. The mob had always had ties to entertainers, singers, comedians, actors who played mob-run clubs, took mob-protected contracts, and smiled through it all. But Sinatra was different. He wasn't just famous. He was iconic. His voice could melt a room. His presence could fill a stage. And in the 1950s, when his career dipped, when Hollywood seemed ready to forget him, it was the outfit who reminded the world that Sinatra wasn't finished yet. A few favors, a few phone calls, and suddenly he had roles again, stages again, spotlight again. And for that, Sinatra was grateful. Grateful and in debt. Sam understood the power of that debt. To him, Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was a tool, a finely polished, golden-voiced instrument that could play in rooms where mobsters could never walk. Politicians, movie executives, high society elites, they flocked to Sinatra. They trusted him, adored him. And wherever Sinatra went, Sam could follow, quietly, invisibly, his hand always resting on the pulse of the room. The Rat Pack became the perfect cover. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, they were stars, entertainers, celebrities who dazzled under the Vegas lights. But for Giancana, they were more than that. They were a shield. Nights spent laughing, drinking, and singing with the Rat Pack blurred the lines between crime and entertainment. To outsiders, Sam wasn't a gangster in those moments. He was just another guest, another name in the crowd. His presence looked glamorous, even innocent, because who questions a man who drinks with Sinatra? But beneath the glamour, business was always happening. Conversations in dark booths weren't just about songs or women. They were about casinos, contracts, political favors. A politician might be hesitant to meet with a mobster, but a night out with Sinatra and his friends? That was acceptable, even enviable. And once they were in the room, once the drinks flowed and the laughter came, the introductions followed. Sinatra would smile, wave Sam over, and just like that, doors that had been locked were open. Sam used those doors carefully. He didn't overwhelm. He didn't demand. He let Sinatra soften the edges, let the glow of fame make him approachable. Then, when the moment was right, he leaned in. A favor here, a promise there, a reminder that support wasn't free, but it was always reliable. Sinatra smoothed the way, and Giancana walked through. Together, they built a bridge between Hollywood's spotlights and the outfit's shadows. For Sinatra, it was a dangerous balancing act. He loved the attention, the power, the sense of invincibility that came with mob protection. But he also feared it. Whispers followed him everywhere, rumors of mob ties, of obligations too heavy to shake. The press occasionally sniffed around, hinting at scandals, questioning his friendships. But Sinatra, proud and defiant, brushed them off. He was the chairman of the board. Who would dare question him? Still, late at night, in quiet moments, he must have felt the weight of the company he kept. For Sam, there was no fear, at least not on the surface. He relished it. Sinatra wasn't just a friend. He was a trophy, a sign that Mooney had transcended the alleys of Little Italy, that he now dined with kings of culture. He paraded the friendship, basked in it, used it like a weapon. When rivals mocked his temper, when critics whispered he was reckless, he only had to point to the company he kept. A man who drank with Sinatra couldn't be dismissed. But like every weapon, it cut both ways. The FBI noticed. Reports began to mention not just Giancana, but Sinatra too. Wiretaps picked up conversations linking the two, blurring the line between entertainment and organized crime. Politicians who had once smiled for pictures began to hesitate, wondering if the glow of Hollywood was worth the risk of mob shadows. The attention grew sharper, hotter, and Sam, always the gambler, believed he could handle it. One story captures the essence of their bond. In the early 60s, Sinatra opened his Palm Springs compound to political figures, Hollywood stars, and friends alike. The Kennedys were among them. And through Sinatra, through that glamorous doorway, Giancana's shadow slipped closer to the highest levels of American politics. It was a connection too dangerous, too tempting, and ultimately, too unstable to last. But in that moment, the illusion was perfect. The mob boss who had once broken bones in alleys was now brushing shoulders with presidents, all thanks to the man with the golden voice. The friendship between Giancana and Sinatra was built on mutual use, on favors exchanged in smoky rooms and whispered introductions. Sinatra gained power, protection, and a lifeline when his career faltered. Giancana gained access, legitimacy, and a stage far larger than Chicago's streets. They laughed together, drank together, celebrated together. But under the laughter lay tension, the kind of unspoken dread that comes when one man owes another more than he can ever repay. As the years passed, the weight of it grew heavier. Sinatra's star soared again, brighter than ever. Giancana's grip tightened, his empire richer than ever. But the spotlight they shared was blinding, and both men knew that light has a way of burning. The FBI wasn't going away. Politicians were growing wary. Rivals within the outfit grumbled louder about Sam's recklessness. What had once looked like triumph now looked like exposure. And yet, Sam never slowed down. He believed Sinatra made him untouchable, that the world's love for the singer shielded them both. But love and fear are fragile currencies. The same doors Sinatra opened could just as easily slam shut. The same spotlight that made Giancana look glamorous could just as easily make him a target. The friendship that had elevated him was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. And as the 60s unfolded, Giancana's use of Sinatra would drag him into even more dangerous waters. Waters filled not with Rat Pack laughter, but with politics, secrets, and betrayals that stretched all the way to Washington. Because in the world Sam Giancana had built, every song had an echo, and some echoes carried the sound of gunfire. The flashbulbs popped like tiny explosions, freezing his face in the glare. Sam Giancana, once a street kid from Chicago's Little Italy, now stood shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood's brightest stars. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was leaning into it, shaping his life into a performance, casting himself as this celebrity gangster. In nightclubs, at parties, even in the gossip columns, Sam wasn't just feared. He was admired, whispered about, envied. But in every photograph, in every staged smile, there lingered an edge, a reminder that beneath the glamour, he was still Mooney, the man whose temper could turn champagne into blood in a single heartbeat. Hollywood was fertile ground for a man like Giancana. The city thrived on illusion, and he was a master of it. Stars looked untouchable on the big screen, but off it they were as fragile and hungry as anyone else. They wanted protection, influence, someone to fix problems the studios couldn't. Sam provided all of that, dressed not as a thug, but as a polished, well-spoken figure who moved as easily through a Beverly Hills mansion as he once had through a smoky backroom in Chicago. The women, especially, drew him deeper into the spotlight. Actresses, singers, models, his affairs became legend. Some were public, splashed in gossip columns. Others whispered only in smoky lounges. To Sam, they were more than lovers. They were symbols. Each one reinforced his image, the gangster who didn't just run rackets, but who also held the attention of the women other men only dreamed about. He turned relationships into currency, proof that he wasn't bound by the rules of the street. But these weren't shallow connections. Behind the glamour, there were moments of intimacy, of vulnerability. Actresses confided their fears to him, about careers that could vanish with a single studio executive's whim. Singers leaned on him when their voices cracked and their contracts turned cold. He offered reassurance, protection, money. To them, he wasn't just Mooney. He was security, a man who could solve problems no lawyer or manager dared touch. Yet, even in his tenderness, there was always an undertone of control. Affection from Giancana was never free. It bound them to him, threads of loyalty woven tighter with every whispered promise. For Sam, these relationships were intoxicating. They allowed him to shed, if only for a moment, the weight of being a mob boss. In their company, he was playful, charming, even tender. But always, he carried the duality, the switchblade smile, the knowledge that behind every laugh was the capacity for violence. The women felt it too. They were drawn to the danger, thrilled by it, yet uneasy. Being with Sam was like dancing in a room lit by candles, never knowing which one might topple and set everything ablaze. The gossip columns began to take notice. They called him a celebrity gangster, half mocking, half reverent. Reporters hinted at his connections, his lovers, his friendships with stars and singers. The public devoured the stories. America had always been fascinated with outlaws, and here was one who didn't lurk in shadows but stood openly in the company of Hollywood royalty. The mix of crime and glamour was irresistible, and Sam played into it, smiling for cameras, dining in restaurants where he knew reporters lingered outside, staging his life as though it were one long performance. But the more he embraced the spotlight, the more nervous his peers became. The old guard hated the attention. Accardo and Ricca had built their power in silence, carefully avoiding headlines. Giancana seemed addicted to them. His affairs with high-profile women, his nights in Hollywood clubs, his appearances alongside Sinatra, it was all fuel for federal agents already circling closer. What Sam saw as a crown, they saw as a target. And targets don't survive long in the outfit. Even Sinatra grew wary at times. The singer adored Sam, relied on him, but also feared the consequences of being too closely tied. Hollywood thrived on scandal, but there were limits. Too much mob smoke around Sinatra threatened to tarnish his carefully crafted image. Still, he couldn't fully pull away. Their bond was too deep, their mutual use too beneficial. Like so many others, Sinatra was caught in Giancana's orbit, dazzled by the glow, uneasy about the burn. Sam, though, didn't flinch. He believed his charisma shielded him, that his charm could disarm even suspicion. He laughed at FBI tales, toyed with reporters, teased rivals. To him, life was a stage, and he was the star. The women on his arm, the stars at his table, the applause in every club. All of it reinforced the illusion that he was untouchable. But illusions, like Hollywood sets, are fragile. One push, one crack, and the backdrop falls, revealing the scaffolding behind it. The irony was sharp. The very glamour that elevated him also deepened his exposure. Agents noted every public appearance. Rival bosses whispered about his recklessness. Politicians grew uneasy about being seen near him. Even some of the women began to pull away, weary of the danger that shadowed his affection. What had once seemed like power now began to feel like weight. And yet, Sam kept pressing forward, doubling down, refusing to step back into the shadows. For a boy from Chicago's alleys, the lure of Hollywood was irresistible. It was the proof that he had made it, that he had risen from scraps to starlight. And in truth, he had. Few mob bosses in history had lived so openly, so flamboyantly, so brazenly entwined with America's cultural icons. He had become something new, a myth in real time, A gangster who wasn't just feared but adored, photographed, imitated. But myths are dangerous. They can't survive under scrutiny. And Sam Giancana's myth was drawing more eyes every day. The women, the parties, the headlines, they were glamorous, yes, but they were also evidence. Evidence for agents, ammunition for rivals, excuses for old allies to question whether Mooney was worth the risk anymore. Late at night, in quiet moments between parties, perhaps Sam felt the cracks. Perhaps he saw the shadow behind the spotlight, the cost of being both king and celebrity. Or perhaps he ignored it, convinced that charm and fear together could keep him safe forever. The truth was already closing in. The FBI was tightening its net. Rivals were sharpening their knives. And in the glitter of Hollywood, amid laughter and applause, the first notes of tragedy were already playing. The celebrity gangster had reached the height of his myth. But myths, by nature, are destined to fall. And as Sam Giancana raised another glass in another Hollywood nightclub, surrounded by stars and whispers, he couldn't know that the glamour he adored was also writing the first lines of his downfall. The smoke in the backroom was thick, curling around the low light that swung overhead. Men leaned over a table, their voices hushed, their eyes fixed on stacks of paper, precinct lists, ward numbers, and names of poll workers who owed more loyalty to envelopes of cash than to the law. Outside, America believed elections were sacred. Inside, Chicago's outfit was preparing to decide the presidency. Sam Giancana sat quietly, studying the numbers, knowing full well that in Cook County, ballots were as pliable as dice in his casinos. The year was 1960, and the stakes were nothing less than the White House. Politics and the outfit had always danced together in Chicago. The city machine thrived on ward bosses who controlled blocks like feudal lords, handing out favors for votes, punishing defiance with silence at the polls. It was a system that blurred democracy into theater. People voted, yes, but behind the curtain, men like Giancana decided how many ballots would actually matter. For decades, aldermen and mayors had relied on the outfit to deliver results. The mob provided the muscle, the intimidation, the quiet manipulation of counts. In return, politicians offered protection, contracts, and a blind eye to the rivers of cash flowing through the city's rackets. By the 1950s, Sam had inherited this role as easily as he had inherited his casinos and gambling dens. But where local politicians were once the prize, now the prize was national. The Kennedys, wealthy, ambitious, hungry, looked to Illinois as a battleground state in the upcoming election. And Illinois meant Chicago, and Chicago meant Giancana. The machine was powerful, but without the outfit's grip on Cook County, nothing was certain. Sam knew it. The Kennedys knew it. And suddenly, the boy from Little Italy found himself holding influence that stretched far beyond the Windy City. The 1960 election was razor-thin, one of the closest in American history. Every vote mattered. But in Chicago, every vote could be manufactured. Precinct captains delivered results not by counting faithfully, but by ensuring numbers aligned with expectations. Dead men voted. Absentee ballots appeared. Whole blocks turned out suspiciously uniform results. And at the center of this quiet storm sat Sam Giancana, the man ensuring that when Cook County spoke, it spoke in favor of John F. Kennedy. The mechanics of the fix were never written down, never openly confessed, but the whispers were relentless. Election night came and went, and the margin of victory in Illinois, just over 8,000 votes, helped push Kennedy into the White House. Without Cook County, without Chicago, the outcome might have been different, and everyone in the outfit knew that. More importantly, Sam knew that. For a moment, it seemed he had not only shaped Chicago's destiny, but the nation's. For Giancana, it wasn't just about politics. It was about pride. He had grown from an alley kid to a man who could tilt the scales of democracy. Presidents rose because of him, and he expected something in return. That was the code of the outfit. Nothing was free. Every favor had a price. But politics was a different kind of game. Unlike gambling, where the house always won, politics had its own house, and it didn't always play fair. Sam believed his influence over the Kennedys would buy him protection, favors, perhaps even a shield against the FBI pressure tightening around him. What he didn't expect was betrayal. Robert Kennedy, the new Attorney General, declared war on organized crime almost immediately, placing Giancana and his empire squarely in the crosshairs. The irony was bitter. The man who had delivered votes was now the man being hunted by those he had helped elevate. Still, in 1960, as the votes were tallied and the victory celebrated, Sam allowed himself to revel in the power. To the public, the election was a triumph of youth and vision. To him, it was proof that democracy could be bent, molded, shaped by hands invisible to ordinary citizens. He had seen the system from the inside, and he knew that ballots were no more sacred than poker chips on a table. And like poker chips, they could be stacked, shuffled, and played as he wished. Inside the outfit, his stature rose even higher. Men who once doubted him now recognized his reach. He wasn't just the boss of casinos and numbers rackets. He was a man who could move presidents. That kind of influence terrified rivals and inspired loyalty. To be in Giancana's orbit now meant brushing shoulders not only with Hollywood stars, but with the very architects of American power. But that orbit was unstable. Each step closer to the White House brought more light, more scrutiny. FBI files grew thicker. Wiretaps buzzed with his name. Senators whispered about mob ties in the election. For Sam, the glamour of power blinded him to the danger of exposure. He still believed he could balance it, that his charm and influence would keep him ahead. But the spotlight burns, and in 1960, it was only beginning to heat. Behind closed doors, politicians who had once smiled in his presence began to pull away. The Kennedys, especially, distanced themselves, aware of the whispers, fearful of scandal. Sam's expectation of loyalty went unmet. The protection he imagined never came. Instead, the Justice Department's gaze fixed firmly on him. What he thought was victory was, in truth, the opening of a trap. Yet, even then, he didn't step back. He had tasted the thrill of power beyond crime, beyond money, beyond fear. He had shaped history, and that was something no indictment, no investigation could take from him. It was intoxicating and dangerous. For the people of Chicago, the election was a blur of celebration and suspicion. For Giancana, it was both his crowning achievement and the seed of his downfall. He had proven that gangsters could shape nations, that ballots could be bent like cards. But in doing so, he had stepped into a game with rules he didn't control, players he couldn't intimidate, and consequences that no bullet could silence. As he sat in Oak Park, cigarette smoke curling in his kitchen, watching the news declare Kennedy the winner, perhaps he smiled, believing the world was his. Perhaps he imagined himself untouchable, a kingmaker as much as a king. But in that very moment, forces far beyond Chicago were already turning against him. And the man who thought he had bought protection would soon discover that politics, unlike crime, demands no loyalty. The victory he helped deliver would become the knife at his throat. The hotel room door closed with a soft click, shutting out the hum of Washington traffic. A man in a dark suit placed a slim briefcase on the table, his expression unreadable. Inside were pills, tiny capsules coated in poison, designed to kill quietly, invisibly. They weren't meant for street hustlers or rival gangsters. They were meant for one man, Fidel Castro. And the man chosen to deliver them wasn't a soldier or a spy. It was Sam Giancana. The CIA had come knocking, and the line between government and mobster blurred into something almost unthinkable. The early 1960s were turbulent. Castro had overthrown Batista's regime in Cuba, shutting down the mob's Havana casinos overnight. Millions in profits evaporated. For men like Giancana, Havana had been a paradise, a place where American tourists poured money into slot machines and roulette wheels while gangsters drank rum with politicians. Suddenly, all of it was gone. And worse, Cuba had fallen into the arms of the Soviet Union. To the CIA, Castro wasn't just a nuisance. He was a threat on America's doorstep. Something had to be done, but assassinations are delicate. The agency couldn't leave fingerprints. They needed men who already lived in shadows, who understood silence and betrayal. That's when Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent turned private operator, appeared with an offer. He wasn't working for the mob, and he wasn't openly CIA. He was the bridge, a man who could deliver the unthinkable request without a badge ever touching it. And on the other side of that bridge stood Sam Giancana. It was almost poetic. The same government sworn to destroy the outfit was now courting one of its most flamboyant bosses. The irony wasn't lost on Giancana. He relished it. Here was proof that power, real power, bent rules. That even Washington, with all its marble buildings and lofty ideals, needed a gangster when the job was dirty enough. The deal was simple in theory. The CIA wanted Castro gone. The mob wanted Havana back. Their goals aligned. Poison capsules were slipped into the briefcase. Contacts in Cuba were lined up, bartenders, waiters, insiders who might slip the toxin into a drink. Sam, along with fellow mobsters Johnny Rosselli and Santo Trafficante, became the architects of a plot that sounded more like a movie script than reality. But nothing is simple when two worlds collide. Spies deal in patience, in layers of deception. Gangsters deal in loyalty and fear. The CIA insisted on secrecy, but secrets are fragile in the mob. Every meeting carried risk. Every whisper could become a headline. And all the while, the FBI continued its war on organized crime, wiretapping phones, shadowing cars, oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind, to the fact that their government colleagues were now using the very men they hunted. For Giancana, the arrangement was intoxicating. He wasn't just a mob boss anymore. He was a player in global politics. He could boast, not openly, but to those who mattered, that presidents owed him, that spies relied on him, that his reach extended from Chicago alleys to Havana palaces. The swagger that had already made him infamous now had an even more dangerous foundation. The plots themselves veered between absurd and chilling. Poison pills delivered in a matchbox. Talk of contaminated cigars. Even exploding seashells planted where Castro liked to swim. Each plan carried the stamp of desperation. And through it all, Giancana stood as the unlikely partner, nodding at ideas, providing access, offering to grease wheels in Havana through old contacts who had once run gambling halls before Castro slammed the doors. But the plans failed. The poison never reached Castro. The cigars were never lit. The seashells remained a fantasy. Each attempt dissolved under the weight of bad luck, betrayal, or sheer impracticality. And with every failure, frustration grew. The CIA wanted results. The mob wanted Havana back. Sam wanted proof that his involvement bought him more than risk. But the one man who mattered most, Fidel Castro, continued to stride across Cuban television screens, cigar in hand, alive and defiant. Even in failure, though, the partnership mattered. It revealed something darker than any single plot. It showed that the lines separating crime from government were not lines at all, but smudges. The same man accused of fixing elections, running casinos, and ordering murders was now sitting at the same table as government agents sworn to uphold law. To the public, America projected morality. In secret, it outsourced murder to Mooney Giancana. The irony deepened when whispers tied the Kennedys to the arrangement. John F. Kennedy, the president Giancana was rumored to have helped elect, now oversaw an administration at war with both Castro and organized crime. Robert Kennedy, the crusading attorney general, poured resources into destroying the outfit, even as his brother's CIA worked with its most flamboyant boss. To Sam, it was betrayal layered on betrayal. He had delivered votes, he had opened doors, and now he was both partner and target, courted and hunted in the same breath. The contradictions didn't seem to bother him outwardly. He laughed, he charmed, he bragged. But deep down, he must have felt the tension. To play both sides is to walk a wire with no safety net. One slip, and the fall is fatal. The CIA could disown him. The FBI could indict him. His own men could question whether the heat he attracted was worth the money he brought in. Yet Sam pressed forward, convinced his charisma and cunning would carry him through. It's worth imagining the scene. A Chicago gangster, raised on street fights and stolen cars, now thumbing through CIA documents in a dim hotel room, discussing assassinations with men whose paychecks carried the government seal. It was a collision of worlds so surreal it felt inevitable. The mob had always claimed influence. Now, for a fleeting moment, it was official. But shadows move quickly. The failure of the Castro plots, combined with the escalating scrutiny on organized crime, left Sam exposed. He had tasted the thrill of global intrigue, but what remained was suspicion. Agents whispered his name. Senators demanded answers. Rivals within the outfit wondered if his CIA ties made him dangerous or expendable. The same connections that elevated him now threatened to crush him. And so, in the early 60s, Sam Giancana stood at a crossroads. To one side, power beyond imagination, presidents, spies, global politics. To the other, the unforgiving reality of the mob, where ambition always ends in betrayal. He straddled both, convinced he could balance them, blind to the fact that both sides were preparing to let him fall. The poison capsules sat unused. Castro lived. Havana remained closed. And in Sam's world, nothing was more dangerous than a deal unfulfilled. The CIA partnership had given him a taste of something larger, but it had also painted a new target on his back. And as the 60s deepened, Sam would discover that some debts can never be repaid, some alliances are too unstable to survive, and some shadows grow so large they swallow the man who cast them. The air in Havana before the revolution was thick with rum, smoke, and the perfume of tourists who believed they had stumbled into paradise. Neon signs flickered above the Malecon. The ocean breeze carried the sounds of dice clattering on green felt, and in the grand casinos, fortunes rose and collapsed in minutes. For American tourists, it was an exotic playground. For the mob, it was heaven on earth. And for Sam Giancana, it was more than just business. It was a dream. A place where the outfit could operate openly, where gambling wasn't hidden in backrooms but celebrated under chandeliers. Havana in the 1950s was Las Vegas before Las Vegas. The difference was, Vegas was still young, still desert and dust, while Cuba was already glamorous. Havana's casinos glittered with European architecture and the energy of a city that never seemed to sleep. Tourists from New York and Miami came in droves, lured by cheap flights and promises of pleasure. Politicians in Washington looked away, content to let President Batista's regime sell Havana to the highest bidder. And the highest bidders, inevitably, were the mob. Sam's ties to Havana ran deep. The outfit, along with the New York families, poured money into the casinos, laundering profits through the slot machines, the card tables, the hotel suites where cash flowed like champagne. The Riviera, the Tropicana, the Nacional, these weren't just casinos. They were temples, built to worship money, sex, and power. And behind the velvet ropes, it was men like Giancana who counted the offerings. He loved Havana not only for the profits, but for the freedom it gave him. In Chicago, everything was shadows, hidden games, bribes to cops, quiet envelopes under tables. In Havana, there was no need for shadows. The mob operated in broad daylight, with government blessing. Politicians were bought wholesale, police worked as security, and Batista's cut ensured silence at the top. For a man like Sam, it was intoxicating. It felt like the future, a vision of what America itself could be if the rules bent just a little further. But dreams are fragile. Beneath the glamour, Havana was cracking. Cubans lived in poverty while mobsters and politicians grew fat. Resentment simmered in the barrios, where young men listened to fiery speeches promising revolution. Fidel Castro's voice began to echo louder, calling out the corruption, naming the casinos as symbols of everything stolen from the people. While tourists sipped mojitos under chandeliers, rebels hid in mountains, sharpening knives and waiting for their moment. Sam, like many in the mob, didn't take it seriously at first. Revolutions had flared before and fizzled. Batista's grip seemed firm, his loyalty assured so long as the bribes flowed. But the grip weakened faster than anyone imagined. In 1959, Castro's forces stormed Havana, Batista fled, and within days the casinos closed their doors. Roulette wheels stopped spinning. Card tables fell silent. The mob's paradise evaporated overnight. For Giancana, it was a personal wound. Millions in profits vanished, but more than money, it was the dream itself, the vision of a mob-run utopia, ripped away. He had believed Havana would be his crown jewel, the place where the outfit could cement its legitimacy on an international stage. Instead, it became a reminder that nothing in his world was permanent. Not power, not wealth, not even dreams. The bitterness ran deep. Havana wasn't just another racket lost. It was a humiliation. And when the CIA came knocking years later, whispering of assassination plots, dangling the chance to remove Castro, Sam's anger at losing Havana made him listen. The agency wanted Castro dead for politics. Sam wanted him dead for profit. It was the rare moment where government and mob aligned, and Havana was the bridge. The Havana dream lived on, even after the casinos closed. Mobsters whispered about what would happen once Castro fell. They imagined reopening the Riviera, restocking the Nacional, welcoming tourists back to a Havana reborn under their control. They drew up plans, even as the revolution deepened and Cuba turned red under Soviet protection. For Sam, Havana was never gone. It was waiting for the day the rebels were crushed and the neon could glow again. But Havana was never coming back. Castro held firm. The CIA plots failed, and every year that passed made the dream more distant. Giancana clung to it anyway, as if the memory itself could sustain him. In quiet moments, he must have replayed the nights when Havana belonged to him, when he walked through casinos with pockets full of cash, when the women smiled and the politicians bowed. It was the pinnacle of everything he believed in. Crime dressed as legitimacy, power wrapped in glamour. The loss of Havana marked more than just the end of a racket. It marked the beginning of the outfit's uneasy marriage with politics and intelligence. Because to chase Havana, Sam bound himself to men in suits who played games even dirtier than the mobs. He entered a world where betrayal was silent, where failures were buried, and where loyalty was worth nothing once the mission changed. He didn't see it then, but Havana was the pivot, the place where his ambition reached beyond crime into politics, espionage, and shadows too vast to control. The Havana dream haunted him. It fueled his choices, justified his risks, and blinded him to the danger of playing both sides. The mob wanted their paradise back. The CIA wanted a thorn removed. Sam stood between them, convinced he could win both ways. But history doesn't give back what it takes. Havana was gone, and chasing its ghost would only drag him deeper into the web that would one day strangle him. As the 60s rolled forward, Havana remained the mirage shimmering just out of reach. The roulette wheels never spun again. The champagne never flowed as it once did. And Sam Giancana, the man who believed he could bend history, never stopped longing for the city that had once made him feel invincible. But every dream carries a shadow, and the shadow of Havana would follow him to his very end. The celebration was still echoing across America when the whispers began to turn. In November of 1960, John F. Kennedy stood before the nation as its new president, young and charismatic, a promise of fresh energy in the White House. But in Chicago, Sam Giancana watched the victory with a different kind of pride. He believed he had helped deliver it. His vote machine in Cook County had worked its magic, tipping the balance in one of the closest elections in history. He expected gratitude. He expected protection. What he got instead was betrayal, and it came in the form of the president's own brother. Robert Kennedy was named Attorney General almost immediately after the inauguration. To the public, it seemed natural. Who better to serve as the nation's top lawman than the brother of the president? But to Giancana, it was a knife disguised as a handshake. Robert was no ally of organized crime. He despised it. He had made his name grilling mob witnesses in Senate hearings, exposing the connections between unions, gambling, and the outfit. Now, with the Justice Department at his command, Robert Kennedy unleashed a war unlike anything Giancana had seen. The irony cut deep. Sam had believed the Kennedys owed him. In his world, favors were currency, and debts were never forgiven. He had delivered votes. He had greased the machine that helped Kennedy reach the Oval Office. In return, he expected shelter. That was the old deal, the code that ran Chicago. But Robert Kennedy didn't play by those rules. He wasn't interested in debts or deals. He wanted blood. He wanted the mob broken, dismantled, erased. Almost overnight, Giancana became one of the most targeted men in America. The FBI ramped up its surveillance, placing wiretaps on his phones, tailing his movements, photographing him outside restaurants and casinos. Agents camped outside his home in Oak Park, their cars parked down the street, cameras clicking whenever he stepped outside. For a man who had always balanced shadows and glamour, the constant presence of federal eyes was suffocating. Sam tried to shrug it off at first. He laughed, mocked the agents, even played games with them. He would send pizzas to their cars, walk outside in his bathrobe to wave, make a show of his defiance. To him, it was theater, a way of reminding both his men and himself that he was still in control. But behind the bravado, the pressure was real. The more Robert Kennedy pressed, the more dangerous Sam's position became, not just with the government, but within his own organization. The outfit valued profit, not publicity, and the heat Sam was drawing threatened both. The contradiction was brutal. On one side, Sam was rumored to have played a part in Kennedy's rise, delivering Cook County votes when they mattered most. On the other, he was now hunted by the very family he thought he had helped. In the mob's language, this was betrayal of the highest order, and betrayal had consequences. Yet, Sam's pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. He boasted to friends that he had the president's ear, that he could still call in favors, that his role in Kennedy's election made him untouchable. Maybe he even believed it, at least for a while. But Washington doesn't run on mob codes. In Washington, loyalty bends to politics, and politics bends to survival. The Kennedys had no choice but to distance themselves from Giancana. Every rumor of mob ties threatened their image. Every whisper of favors endangered their legitimacy. Sam wasn't an asset anymore. He was a liability, and Robert Kennedy knew it. He pushed harder. Federal indictments piled up. Witnesses were dragged before grand juries. Hearings exposed the outfit's reach in labor unions, gambling, even Hollywood. Sam's name appeared again and again, a reminder that the celebrity gangster was no longer just a curiosity. He was a target. The FBI called it a crusade. Giancana called it treachery. In the shadows, the relationship between the mob and the Kennedys grew darker. Some mobsters grumbled that they should never have helped in the first place. Others whispered of deals gone sour, of promises unkept. The resentment boiled, and Giancana, caught between pride and survival, fumed. He had played the kingmaker. Now the king's own brother wanted him destroyed. The tension spilled into every corner of his life. His empire in gambling still produced millions, but each suitcase of cash carried the weight of federal eyes. His affairs with Hollywood women continued, but every photograph threatened scandal. Even his friendship with Sinatra grew strained, as the singer tried to balance loyalty to Sam with his own ties to the Kennedys. What had once been an advantage, a bridge between mob, entertainment, and politics, was now a tightrope fraying at both ends. Sam's temper grew sharper. Allies whispered that Mooney was more unpredictable than ever, swinging between charm and rage, convinced that betrayal lurked in every corner. Perhaps he wasn't wrong. Within the outfit, some began to see him as a liability, a boss whose ego was outpacing his control. In Washington, Robert Kennedy's campaign only grew more relentless, framing Giancana as the embodiment of organized crime's cancer. The press ate it up. Headlines screamed his name. What had once been glamour was now stigma. And yet, Giancana clung to the idea that he was still essential. He still believed that the Kennedys, despite Robert's fury, couldn't ignore him. After all, secrets have gravity. If Sam truly had knowledge of backroom deals during the election, if he could prove his hand in Kennedy's rise, then maybe he thought he held a card no one could take from him. But cards in this game were slippery. Evidence vanished. Witnesses were silenced. And Washington played by rules far crueler than Chicago. The more Robert pressed, the more isolated Sam became. The alliances he had built with Hollywood stars began to falter. Political contacts grew cold. Even his own soldiers whispered about the danger of being too close. The spotlight that had once made him powerful was now burning him alive. Still, he refused to step down, to retreat, to admit that the tide had turned. Pride had carried him from alley fights to Havana casinos, from the vote machine to CIA backrooms. He couldn't believe it would abandon him now. But pride is a dangerous shield. It blinds as much as it protects. The betrayal of the Kennedys marked a turning point. Giancana had reached higher than most mob bosses ever dared, brushing against the presidency itself. But the higher he climbed, the harder the fall. Robert Kennedy's crusade was more than just a legal battle. It was personal, and Sam was unprepared for the relentlessness of a man who believed he was fighting not just crime, but evil itself. As the 1960s deepened, the pressure mounted. Giancana was no longer just the celebrity gangster, no longer just the man who skimmed millions from Vegas and Havana. He was now a symbol, a target, a reminder that organized crime and politics had once danced too close. And symbols are dangerous to leave standing. In his Oak Park home, with FBI cars parked on the street outside, Sam must have wondered how it had all turned so quickly. The boy who once fought for scraps in Little Italy had helped tip an election. Now, the president's brother wanted him caged, or worse. And somewhere in that contradiction, in that irony sharp enough to cut steel, Sam Giancana began to realize that his empire wasn't just threatened by rivals in the outfit. It was threatened by the very government he thought he had helped build. The man who had dreamed of being untouchable was now finding out that in America, even the most feared gangster couldn't escape the reach of politics. And the war between Giancana and the Kennedys was only just beginning. The phone clicked in the dead of night, a soft sound followed by a voice that seemed to tremble with both allure and desperation. Marilyn Monroe's voice. To the public, she was America's goddess, a woman who could stop a room with a smile. To Sam Giancana, she was something else, a fragile star caught between power and ruin. The rumors swirled like smoke. Monroe was tied to the president, tangled with his brother, and somehow, impossibly, with Giancana himself. Whether whispers or truth, the triangle carried enough weight to shake Washington, Hollywood, and the outfit all at once. The story of Monroe and Giancana is one of those legends where fact and myth blur until they become inseparable. Some said they met through Sinatra. Others whispered it was the outfit who orchestrated the connection, weaving Marilyn into the web as both lover and leverage. She was magnetic, lonely, and drawn to powerful men. And Sam, with his charm and danger, was the kind of man who could make even America's brightest star feel protected. Protected or trapped. For Monroe, the affair, if it happened, was another attempt to find stability in a world that consumed her. She had loved presidents and movie stars, but with Sam, she found a man who operated outside the rules of Hollywood and politics. He was raw, dangerous, a reminder that not all power came from cameras or elections. With him, she felt the rush of stepping off stage into something darker, something forbidden. But the same allure also made it perilous. Giancana wasn't just a man. He was Mooney, the boss of Chicago, the king of gamblers, the man whose name alone made people shiver. For Giancana, Marilyn was more than just another lover. She was a weapon. If the whispers were true, she had been with both John and Robert Kennedy. That placed her at the intersection of the most glamorous woman in the world, the most powerful family in America, and the most feared mobster in Chicago. To Sam, it was leverage, the kind of secret that could buy him protection or destroy his enemies. But secrets that dangerous have a way of burning everyone who holds them. The whispers multiplied. Did Monroe confide in Sam? Did she reveal Kennedy's secrets in the haze of late-night phone calls and whispered confessions? Did Giancana use her to gain influence, to tighten his grip on the White House? None of it was ever proven, but in the world of power, proof was secondary. Rumors themselves could kill reputations, topple alliances, even end lives. And once the whispers began, they never stopped. By the summer of 1962, Monroe's life was unraveling. Her career faltered, her health crumbled, and her ties to the Kennedys grew more complicated by the day. Some claimed she threatened to expose her affairs, to reveal secrets that could damage the presidency. Others whispered she was silenced before she could speak. When she died in August, an overdose ruled as probable suicide, the rumors exploded. To many, Her death felt too convenient, too sudden, too clean. And in the shadows, Giancana's name appeared once again. For the outfit, Monroe's ties to both Kennedy and Giancana looked like opportunity and liability at once. Opportunity, because the implication of a mob boss sharing a lover with the president could be used as quiet blackmail. Liability, because if Monroe talked, if she revealed too much, the spotlight could burn everyone involved. To this day, conspiracy theories circle her death like vultures, some pointing to the Kennedys, others to the mob, still others to the CIA itself. No answer ever silenced the questions. What mattered for Giancana wasn't just the truth of the affair. It was the perception. The rumors tied him to Monroe, and by extension, to the President of the United States. For a man who had built his empire on both fear and glamour, it was intoxicating. He was no longer just the mob boss in Oak Park. He was the man in the triangle, a figure lurking in the shadows of America's most glamorous scandal. But scandals don't stay contained. Every rumor hardened the FBI's focus. Every whisper deepened Robert Kennedy's fury. To him, Giancana wasn't just organized crime. He was a parasite entwined with his own family. The vendetta grew hotter, the surveillance heavier, the war more personal. And Sam, blinded by pride, still believed he could balance it all. In private, perhaps he wondered if Monroe's death was a warning. A reminder that in games this dangerous, everyone was expendable. Or perhaps he dismissed it, convinced his own charisma would shield him from the same fate. But the truth lingered in the air like smoke. Secrets had weight, and the weight of Monroe's secrets was unbearable. The Monroe Triangle was never about love alone. It was about leverage. It was about power exchanged in bedrooms, about whispers that could topple presidencies, about the fragile line between intimacy and betrayal. For Sam Giancana, it was both his triumph and his curse. He had touched the world of presidents and starlets, but in doing so, he had tied himself to tragedies too vast to escape. By the time Monroe was buried, the questions had already taken on a life of their own. Did Sam Giancana share her bed? Did he use her to tighten his grip on the Kennedys? Did she die because she knew too much? The answers were buried with her, leaving only shadows behind. But for Giancana, the damage was already done. He was no longer just a gangster. He was now part of America's greatest unsolved scandal, a figure in a triangle that blurred love, politics, and death. And as the whispers grew louder, Sam must have realized that what had once been leverage was now a curse. Because in the mob, in politics, and in Hollywood alike, the most dangerous thing isn't a bullet or a wiretap. It's a secret everyone wants, but no one can afford to hold. The Monroe Triangle had made him powerful. It had also made him vulnerable. And as the 1960s darkened, the triangle would cast a shadow that followed him all the way to his violent end. The pills were so small they could vanish inside a sugar cube. White capsules, each filled with enough poison to kill a man silently, without trace. They sat in a matchbox on a hotel nightstand, next to a glass of bourbon and an ashtray thick with cigar smoke. The men in the room weren't mobsters alone, and they weren't CIA agents alone. They were both, together, joined in a conspiracy so strange it almost felt unreal. Their mission was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to achieve: kill Fidel Castro. And sitting at the center of this web, balancing espionage and the underworld, was Sam Giancana. It wasn't the first time the mob and the CIA had worked side by side, but it was perhaps the most surreal. Castro had humiliated both. For the CIA, he was a communist ally of the Soviet Union, a thorn only 90 miles from Florida. For the mob, he was the thief who had slammed shut the doors of Havana's casinos, cutting off a river of money. Each side had its reasons, and together they created one of the strangest marriages in American history: spies and gangsters plotting murder like businessmen plotting a merger. Giancana reveled in the irony. Here was the United States government, sworn enemy of organized crime, slipping him poison capsules like contraband. It confirmed everything he had always believed: power bends rules. When the stakes are high enough, even lawmen need criminals. It fed his pride, deepened his sense of invincibility. But beneath the swagger was danger. Every meeting was a secret stacked on top of other secrets, and secrets that heavy could crush anyone who tried to carry them. The methods were bizarre. Poison hidden in pills. Talk of infecting Castro's diving suit with lethal fungus. Even an exploding seashell, designed to catch the Cuban leader's eye while he swam. The plans sounded like pulp fiction, but the desperation was real. The CIA wanted results. Giancana and his fellow mobsters, like Johnny Rosselli and Santo Trafficani, offered access to Havana contacts who might slip a capsule into a drink or a meal. Old bartenders, waiters, and casino men still loyal to the mob were called upon, their lives dangling on promises of payment and fear. But Cuba wasn't easy to penetrate anymore. Castro's revolution had gutted the old networks. The casinos were closed, the mob's allies scattered or arrested, and Havana itself was crawling with informants loyal to the new regime. Every attempt met resistance. The pills never reached Castro. The waiters vanished. The plans dissolved into air. And with each failure, frustration grew heavier on both sides of the alliance. For Giancana, the failures carried more than just political weight. They carried personal stakes. He had tied his credibility to these operations, boasting that the outfit could succeed where government plots had failed. Every collapse made him look weaker, not stronger. And in the mob, weakness is blood in the water. His enemies inside Chicago whispered that Mooney was playing with fire, mixing himself up with government men who would discard him the second it became convenient. His allies questioned whether the heat from Washington, already burning hot, was worth the risks he was taking. But Sam couldn't back down. He had tasted the thrill of being more than a gangster, of sitting at tables where international power was discussed in whispers. For a boy raised in the alleys of Little Italy, it was intoxicating. To admit failure now would mean shrinking back to Chicago rackets, to gambling dens and union disputes. He wanted more. He wanted to straddle both worlds, the underworld and the shadow world of espionage, convinced he could balance them like cards in his hand. That balance grew harder every day. The FBI's war on organized crime was intensifying under Robert Kennedy, who despised Giancana personally. Wiretaps caught his conversations. Cars trailed him through Oak Park. Agents sat outside his house at all hours. And yet, in secret, another branch of government was handing him poison pills and asking for his help. It was a contradiction so absurd it almost felt like a joke. But for Giancana, it was deadly serious. The pressure took its toll. Friends noticed his rages grew sharper, his moods darker. He trusted fewer people. He snapped at allies, accused them of betrayal, and kept secrets so tightly that even his closest lieutenants felt frozen out. To some, it looked like paranoia. To others, it looked like the weight of two worlds pressing down at once. And still, the plots continued. Capsules passed through hands. Contacts in Havana whispered promises. Each attempt ended the same: failure. Castro lived, stronger than ever, his grip on Cuba tightening, his image turning him into a symbol of defiance against both Washington and the mob. The longer he lived, the more humiliating it became for the men sworn to end him. And each humiliation fed the tension between Giancana and the government that had chosen him as an ally. The irony ran deeper still. Castro knew. He boasted of plots against him, laughed about the attempts on his life, reveled in surviving what seemed like endless assassination schemes. For Giancana, every one of Castro's smirks was another wound, another reminder that the mob had lost its paradise and could not take it back. Havana had become not just a lost dream, but a daily humiliation. The CIA kept calling, but the mob's patience thinned. Some in the outfit wondered why they were risking so much for nothing. They muttered that Sam was blinded by his pride, more interested in playing spy than in making money. Others saw the danger more clearly. If these plots ever surfaced publicly, if proof ever emerged of the CIA's dealings with Giancana, the fallout would be catastrophic. The outfit could survive federal raids and indictments, but could it survive being caught as a partner of the government? Sam didn't listen. Or maybe he refused to hear. He believed he was indispensable. He believed the CIA and needed him too badly to ever cut him loose. He believed the outfit would never dare replace him because no one else had his charisma, his connections, his ability to sit with both Sinatra and spies. It was pride, and it was a mistake. The truth was already creeping closer. Washington was growing nervous. Failures mounted, pressure built, and whispers of exposure began to haunt the halls of the agency. If the truth came out, that the United States had partnered with mob bosses to kill a foreign leader, it would be a scandal beyond imagination. And in scandals, scapegoats are always needed. Sam didn't see himself as a scapegoat. He still saw himself as the kingmaker, the man who helped elect a president, the man who held Hollywood in one hand and Havana in the other. But the ground was shifting beneath him. The CIA could vanish into silence. The outfit could turn on him in an instant. And the Kennedys were already sharpening their knives. The poison capsules still sat in drawers. The Havana contacts still whispered promises. But Castro lived. And with every breath the Cuban leader took, Sam Giancana's own grip on power weakened, strained by the absurd balancing act of being both outlaw and government partner. It was a tightrope he could never step off. And each step forward brought him closer to the fall. The numbers on the ledger told the story better than any speech. Millions flowing in from casinos in Las Vegas. Millions more skimmed from unions, trucking, construction, and gambling dens in Chicago. Offshore accounts whispered of profits from Latin America. And even across the ocean, in Europe, hints of outfit influence were beginning to surface. By the early 1960s, Sam Giancana sat at the head of an empire that stretched further than Al Capone could have ever dreamed. For a boy once stealing bread in Little Italy, it was the pinnacle. For the United States government, it was proof that organized crime wasn't just surviving, it was thriving at its peak. Chicago remained the heart of it all, the engine that pumped blood through the outfit's veins. From there, Giancana controlled the city's gambling rackets, the policy wheels that never truly died, and the unions that kept the outfit's grip on industry strong. Truckers, dock workers, construction crews. Many paid dues to unions the outfit quietly managed, ensuring that every paycheck carried a cut upward. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. A strike here, a slowdown there. Giancana could paralyze industries with a phone call, and businessmen knew it. They paid to keep the wheels moving, and those payments only made the outfit stronger. But Chicago was only one part of the map. In Las Vegas, Giancana's men oversaw casinos like the Sands and the Riviera, skimming profits before they ever hit the books. The skim was an art form, invisible to tourists who believed they were watching glamorous shows under neon lights. In reality, the money that flowed from Vegas to Chicago was the outfit's lifeblood. Suitcases stuffed with cash flew out under the noses of regulators, each dollar feeding an empire that no courtroom could fully trace. For Sam, Vegas wasn't just profit. It was proof that the mob could build a city, turn desert into gold, and keep it running like a well-oiled machine. Latin America brought another dimension. With Havana gone, the outfit turned its eye further south, establishing ties in Mexico, Venezuela, and beyond. Casinos, smuggling routes, and even political contacts fell into their orbit. The global underworld was tightening, and Giancana was at its center. He wasn't just a Chicago boss anymore. He was a man whose reach stretched into foreign governments, whose deals crossed borders, whose wealth couldn't be contained in one city or even one country. Europe, too, began to hear whispers of the outfit's touch. Connections in Italy, in France, in Switzerland. The flow of money was global now, laundered through banks that asked no questions. Giancana's men traveled quietly, meeting with figures who blurred the line between politics and crime. The outfit wasn't just a gang. It was becoming a network, a shadow economy, a parallel system of power that rivaled legitimate nations. Sam thrived in this world. He loved the feeling of being more than a gangster, more than just Mooney. He was a figure whose influence reached from Chicago alleys to international boardrooms. He could walk into a Vegas showroom and be greeted like royalty, then take a call from a contact in Mexico about a deal worth millions. The duality excited him, the sense that he wasn't just a criminal boss, but a man shaping the very fabric of economies. But with expansion came exposure. Each new venture brought new risks, new rivals, new eyes watching. The FBI intensified its pursuit, filing reports that described the outfit as a national threat, its reach unparalleled. Robert Kennedy's Justice Department named Giancana directly, painting him as the embodiment of organized crime's cancer. Headlines screamed his name, no longer in whispers of glamour, but in warnings of danger. The irony was sharp. The more global he became, the more local pressure closed in around him. Inside the outfit, tensions brewed. Some old guard bosses worried that Giancana's flamboyance endangered them all. They preferred the quiet rule of men like Castro, who stayed in shadows and let the money speak for itself. Sam, by contrast, enjoyed the spotlight, enjoyed the image of being a celebrity gangster. To his critics, this was recklessness. To Sam, it was strength. He believed that fear and fascination kept him safe, that his myth was as powerful as his money. But myths have cracks, and cracks invite challengers. Still, for a time, the outfit under Giancana truly was at its peak. Money flowed from every corner, and even Washington couldn't deny the breadth of his reach. He was part of CIA plots against Castro, his influence tied to national security itself. He was linked to Hollywood through Sinatra, to politics through Chicago's vote machine, to international crime through Havana and Mexico. Few mob bosses in history had managed such breadth of influence. He was no longer just a king in Chicago. He was a shadow sovereign, a ruler without borders. Yet the higher he climbed, the more fragile the empire became. The scim in Vegas, once invisible, began to attract regulators. Union control, once absolute, faced government crackdowns. International contacts, once promising, became liabilities as foreign governments changed hands. And through it all, the Justice Department's crusade only grew sharper. Each hearing, each indictment, chipped at the illusion of invincibility. For Giancana, the contradiction was unbearable. He stood at the height of power, yet he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He strutted through Vegas, drank champagne in Havana, whispered deals in Mexico, but each step forward carried the echo of footsteps behind him. Agents, rivals, politicians, all closing in. He had built an empire larger than any before him. But empires, by nature, carry the seeds of their own collapse. In quiet moments, perhaps he knew. Perhaps he saw the fragility beneath the wealth, the shadows lengthening behind the neon. Or perhaps he believed, as he always had, that his charisma, his unpredictability, his sheer audacity would shield him forever. But history doesn't bend for pride, and the outfit's peak was also the beginning of its unraveling. For now, though, in the early 1960s, Sam Giancana sat at the summit. His reach was global, his power unrivaled, his name whispered in Havana, in Vegas, in Mexico, in Chicago. He had become what he always dreamed, not just a gangster, but a kingmaker, a global figure in a world that pretended he didn't exist. And yet, just beyond the summit, storms were forming. The FBI tightening its net, rivals waiting in shadows, politicians sharpening knives. The peak, as always, was only the prelude to the fall. The car was always there. Sometimes it was a black sedan, other times a plain Ford parked just far enough down the street to look casual. But Sam Giancana knew. He could feel their eyes on him. The men inside weren't gamblers, and they weren't mobsters. They were agents. The FBI had made him a target, and they wanted him to feel it every single day. It hadn't always been this way. For years, J. Edgar Hoover had publicly downplayed organized crime, calling it a myth cooked up by sensationalist reporters. But Robert Kennedy's rise to Attorney General changed the tune. Under his relentless pressure, Hoover finally declared war. And at the top of the FBI's list stood Giancana, the flashy Chicago boss who seemed to taunt the law with every tailored suit, every night in Las Vegas, every headline about his ties to celebrities and politicians. Surveillance became constant. Wiretaps clicked into his phones. Microphones hid in restaurants, in bars, even in homes of those close to him. Informants whispered his movements, his deals, his moods. The Bureau built a portrait of his life piece by piece, turning every conversation, every laugh, every careless remark into evidence. It wasn't just law enforcement anymore. It was obsession. Giancana had become the symbol Robert Kennedy wanted to destroy, the face of organized crime that had to be crushed to prove the Justice Department's resolve. Sam tried to turn the surveillance into theater. He waved to the agents parked outside his Oak Park home. He sent pizzas and bottles of whiskey to their cars, mocking their presence, as if daring them to come closer. He laughed at the wiretaps, convinced he could out-talk any recording, any transcript. To his men, he played the role of the untouchable boss, a man too clever, too powerful to ever be trapped. But in the quiet hours, the pressure weighed heavy. No man can live under constant eyes without feeling the walls close in. The FBI's tactics were relentless. They didn't need to catch him with a gun in his hand or a suitcase of money. They needed patterns, bits of information that, when stitched together, painted the picture of a criminal empire. Conversations about casino profits, mentions of union bosses, careless remarks about political connections. Each piece alone seemed small. Together, they formed a noose. And Sam knew it. Informants were the most dangerous threat. Men he trusted, men he had raised in the outfit, flipped under federal pressure. Some talked for money, others for protection. The Bureau cultivated them carefully, feeding their words back into wiretaps, layering truth with betrayal. For a man like Giancana, who relied on loyalty like oxygen, it was suffocating. He began to suspect everyone. Paranoia wasn't a flaw in his world, it was survival. But paranoia also cracks empires, and cracks invite collapse. The agents who shadowed him became a kind of mirror. They recorded his anger, his charm, his defiance. They wrote in their reports about his habits, his mistresses, his gambling. They studied him not as a man, but as a puzzle to be solved. And the more they studied, the more they saw the contradictions, how he strutted with pride in public, yet raged at the pressure in private. How he clung to his image as a celebrity gangster, while the law stripped away the myth, exposing the man beneath. Sam still believed he could balance it. He had survived wars within the outfit, betrayals, assassinations. He told himself he could survive this too. But the FBI wasn't a rival crew. It wasn't a jealous boss. It was a machine, grinding day and night, never tiring, never forgetting. And machines, unlike men, could not be intimidated. The war with the Bureau wasn't just legal. It was psychological. Every tale, every tap, every knock on the door was designed to remind him that he wasn't free, that the walls were closing in. For a man who had built his life on control, on bending others to his will, the constant reminder that he was being controlled was unbearable. It ate at his pride, at his sense of invincibility. And pride, once cracked, becomes weakness. Inside the outfit, whispers grew. Some allies wondered if Sam had brought too much heat, if his flamboyance had made him more of a liability than a leader. Others feared the wiretaps, unsure what he might have said, what the FBI might have recorded. Loyalty began to thin, eroded by fear and doubt. And Sam, already suspicious, grew more volatile, his temper sharper, his trust nearly gone. The irony was cruel. At the very moment his empire stretched globally, with profits flowing from Vegas, Latin America, and Europe, his world at home was shrinking. Each day brought new pressure, new surveillance, new cracks. The empire looked unstoppable on paper. But power is not just money, it is perception. And the perception was shifting. To the public, to Washington, to even his own men. Giancana no longer looked untouchable. He looked hunted. Late at night, sitting in his Oak Park kitchen with cigarette smoke curling around him, he must have felt the weight. The car parked outside. The tape recorders humming in some office. The betrayal of men he once trusted. The laughter of politicians who had once needed him now replaced with the cold fury of Robert Kennedy. He had built an empire too large to hide, and now every inch of it was being mapped, dissected, prepared for destruction. And yet, Sam refused to step back. He still played the role, still smiled for reporters, still mocked the agents outside his door. But behind the smile was a truth he couldn't escape. The FBI's net was tightening. Slowly, methodically, with the patience of men who knew that one day Inevitably, he would slip. The walls were closing. The empire was shaking. And the man who once believed himself untouchable was beginning to see the shadow of the fall. The bureau wasn't done. They were only getting started. The voices around the table had grown sharper, colder. Where once there had been laughter and toasts, now there was silence broken by muttered words and sideways glances. Sam Giancana sat at the head, cigarette smoke curling above him, but the air was heavy with something he could feel in his gut: distrust. His outfit, was no longer moving as one. Paranoia had seeped in like water through cracks in a dam, and those cracks were widening. At first, Giancana thought it was just nerves. The FBI pressure, the endless surveillance, the headlines dragging his name into the spotlight, it would rattle any man. But this was more than nerves. Old allies were pulling away. Men who once deferred to his word now hesitated. The whispers in backrooms weren't about profits or casinos anymore. They were about him. Was Mooney losing his touch? Was he bringing too much heat? Was it time for someone else to steer the ship? The most dangerous silence came from Tony Accardo. Joe Batters, the man who had quietly ruled for years after Capone, had always preferred the shadows. Accardo had trusted Sam once, grooming him, giving him the reins when he stepped aside. But trust in the mob is never unconditional. Accardo valued discretion, and Sam had become the opposite: loud, flamboyant, reckless with attention. The FBI wasn't just watching Giancana. They were watching everyone. And Accardo, cautious as ever, didn't like being caught in another man's storm. Sam sensed it. He could feel the distance. Accardo no longer vouched for him in the same way, no longer shielded him when others grumbled. Without Accardo's quiet backing, Giancana was exposed. It wasn't a betrayal yet, but it was a warning. In the outfit, being isolated was the first step toward being replaced. Inside his own crew, paranoia gnawed at him. He had always been unpredictable. His temper earned him the nickname Mooney, but now it hardened into something darker. He accused lieutenants of talking too much, of plotting behind his back. Men who had served him faithfully for years found themselves frozen out, or worse, threatened. Loyalty, once his strongest weapon, was eroding. The FBI's wiretaps had made everyone suspect, and Sam's fury only deepened the distrust. Rival factions began to maneuver. In Chicago, leadership wasn't a throne, it was a balancing act. Power shifted quietly, alliances formed in whispers, and decisions were made in backrooms far from the spotlight. As Giancana alienated allies, others saw opportunity. They spoke carefully, testing loyalties, floating the idea that perhaps Mooney had become a liability. No one dared move openly, not yet. But the seeds were there, planted in silence, watered with fear. Sam responded the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip. He demanded more control, more deference, more displays of loyalty. But power isn't maintained by force alone. The harder he squeezed, the more men slipped through his fingers. What once was fear mixed with respect now tilted dangerously toward fear alone. And fear, by itself, breeds betrayal. Even the global empire he had built began to show cracks. Vegas skim operations grew tense as rivals questioned whether the FBI's pressure would unravel the scheme. Latin American contacts grew wary, uncertain if dealing with Giancana still offered protection or invited disaster. The outfit's strength was always its unity, its ability to move like a single organism. Now, under Sam, that unity frayed. Different factions looked not to expand, but to survive. And survival meant questioning the boss. The tension boiled behind closed doors. Men spoke cautiously in his presence, choosing their words like men defusing a bomb. His rages were more frequent now, eruptions that left rooms in silence. Some whispered that Mooney had lost his mind, that the paranoia had consumed him. Others defended him, insisting his temper had always been part of his genius. But the truth was harder. Giancana wasn't just Mooney anymore. He was a man under siege, by the FBI, by rivals, even by his own doubts. What hurt him most was the feeling of betrayal from men he had once trusted like brothers. Accardo's distance was a knife. Paul Ricca's silence was another. Even Sinatra, once a loyal ally, had stepped back under the glare of scandal. Giancana had built his empire on relationships, politicians, entertainers, mob bosses, and now, one by one, those relationships frayed. The man who once seemed to have everyone in his corner now sat in rooms where he felt utterly alone. Still, he refused to yield. Pride wouldn't let him. He strutted in public, dressed sharp, his smile wide, projecting the same image he always had. Mooney, untouchable, the man who drank with presidents and stars. But in the quiet, in the back rooms, the reality was darker. He was a man surrounded by shadows, unsure which one hid a knife. The outfit had reached its peak under his reign, stretching across continents, touching politics and intelligence alike. But peaks are dangerous places. There's only one direction to go, and rivals were already waiting for him to stumble. Paranoia wasn't just his flaw, it was his reality. He had enemies in every direction and fewer friends than ever before. The room grew colder with each meeting. Men who once leaned in to hear him now leaned back, calculating. His empire was vast, but his grip was slipping. And in the world of the outfit, a slipping grip was an invitation. The whispers grew louder. Perhaps Mooney wasn't the man to lead anymore. Perhaps someone quieter, steadier, less flamboyant was needed. Perhaps his time had passed. Sam laughed it off in public, but the truth gnawed at him. For the first time, he wondered not if someone was plotting against him, but when. And in the shadows of Chicago, men were already preparing their answers. The night he left Chicago, Sam Giancana must have known it was over. Not the empire, not yet, but his grip on the city he had ruled with swagger and fury. The order had come quietly, not in gunfire or betrayal in the streets, but in a decision made by men who had once trusted him. Tony Accardo, silent and calculating, decided that Mooney had become too much of a liability. The FBI's constant surveillance, the headlines, the scandals, Sam had drawn too much heat. And in the outfit, when heat threatens the whole, it doesn't matter how high you've climbed. You step aside, or you are pushed aside. Exile wasn't punishment in the traditional sense. It was survival. The outfit had no use for dead legends, not yet. Instead, Giancana was forced into a kind of living purgatory. In 1966, he fled south, crossing into Mexico. He settled in Cuernavaca, a resort town lush with bougainvillea and mountain air, far removed from the grim streets of Chicago. On the surface, it looked like paradise. But for Sam, it was a gilded cage. Life in Cuernavaca was strange. He lived in a white stucco villa with tiled floors and iron gates, guarded by both his own men and by shadows he couldn't see. The CIA kept tabs on him, curious about his old ties to Havana, his role in their Castro plots. The FBI watched as well, never letting him slip from their files. Even in exile, Giancana was too important to ignore. It was as if his house in Mexico sat under glass, part vacation home, part observation chamber. For a man who had once held court in Chicago's nightclubs and Vegas showrooms, the isolation must have been suffocating. He could still make calls, send instructions, manage pieces of his empire from afar. But distance dilutes power. Orders carried less weight when whispered across borders. Rivals back home took advantage, stepping into rackets he once controlled. His absence gave space for new players to maneuver, and slowly, the outfit adjusted to life without him at the helm. Still, Giancana clung to the illusion of control. He continued to meddle in rackets, directing gambling interests, lending influence where he could. Contacts in Latin America provided opportunities, drug routes, smuggling ventures, new channels of profit that appealed to a man who refused to believe his best days were behind him. But in truth, he was a king without a throne, his reach diminished, his power corroding. The exile years revealed something darker, a man caught between pride and decay. Giancana had always been larger than life, unpredictable, magnetic. But in Mexico, he became a shadow of himself, restless, suspicious, watching his back even in paradise. He drank heavily, his temper flaring at small slights, his paranoia growing sharper. The agents who watched him wrote reports about his moods, his visitors, his habits. To them, he was a subject to be studied. To the outfit, he was a problem deferred. And yet, even in exile, his name carried weight. Celebrities still whispered about him. Politicians still remembered the votes he had delivered. The CIA still considered him a man with connections worth monitoring. He had become something larger than Chicago, a figure whose legend extended into politics, Hollywood, and espionage. But legends are fragile when the man behind them begins to crack. The years stretched on. 8 years in Cuernavaca, 8 years of distance from the city he had once ruled. For a man like Giancana, time itself was the cruelest punishment. The world moved on without him. Ricardo kept the outfit steady. New leaders rose. Old loyalties faded. By the early 1970s, Mooney was no longer the force he had been. He was a relic, remembered, respected, but increasingly irrelevant. Yet he couldn't accept irrelevance. He still believed he mattered, still believed he could reclaim his place if given the chance. In private, he raged about betrayal, about being pushed aside by men who lacked his vision, his daring. He told himself exile was temporary, that the outfit would need him again. Perhaps he believed the CIA would call once more, that Washington would need his underworld touch in the shadows of the Cold War. But the truth was simpler. The world had passed him by. The FBI, however, had not. They still wanted him back in the United States. They still saw him as a key figure in understanding organized crime's global reach. Reports from Cuernavaca described their patience, their determination to wait until the time was right. For them, Giancana wasn't just a man in exile. He was a future witness, a potential informant, a man who might one day crack under pressure. The outfit's patience, too, had limits. For years, they allowed him to sit in Mexico, a safe distance away, his power neutered but his legend intact. But legends have expiration dates. As the 70s dawned, Chicago bosses wondered whether keeping Mooney alive, even in exile, was still worth the risk. He knew too much about Havana, about Vegas, about the Kennedys, about the CIA. Knowledge like that is both shield and curse. And as Sam aged in Mexico, his shield began to look more like a target. In 1974, his exile ended abruptly. Mexican authorities, under pressure, arrested him and handed him over to the FBI. After 8 years in the sun, Giancana was returned to Chicago, older, wearier, but still proud. The man who had once believed he was untouchable walked back into a city where his power was gone, his allies cautious, and his enemies patient. The exile had preserved him physically, but it had cost him everything else. His grip on the outfit was gone. His influence in Vegas had shifted to others. His political connections had withered. Even his legend, once untouchable, now felt frayed, whispered about more as a cautionary tale than a triumph. And yet, Giancana himself refused to see it that way. He still carried himself like Mooney, still believed he could step back into the center of power. But time is merciless. Exile had not protected him. It had only delayed the inevitable. Sam Giancana came home not as a king returning to his throne, but as a marked man stepping back into the shadows of betrayal and unfinished business. And the unfinished business was waiting. The sun was just beginning to rise over Cuernavaca when the knock came. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor or the nervous rap of a visitor. It was firm, deliberate, final. Sam Giancana knew before the door opened that his time in Mexico had ended. After 8 years of exile, Mexican authorities, pressured by Washington, were there to escort him out. There was no gunfire, no mob hitmen, just a quiet handover, a reminder that even in paradise, he was never free. In July of 1974, Giancana was flown back to the United States, delivered like a package no one wanted but everyone needed to deal with. It wasn't the triumphant return of a king. It was the forced extradition of a man who had become both liability and commodity. For the FBI, he was unfinished business. For Congress, he was suddenly valuable, an unwilling witness to secrets buried beneath layers of Cold War espionage. For the outfit, he was a dangerous relic who knew too much. The plane touched down, and with it, the illusion of power he had clung to in Cuernavaca evaporated. Reporters crowded, flashing cameras, hungry for a glimpse of the infamous Mooney. He still wore the tailored suit, still held his chin high, but the years in exile showed in the lines of his face. He tried to project defiance, as he always had, but behind the smile, there was an edge of unease. This wasn't the Chicago he had left. The world had changed, and so had the rules. Almost immediately, Giancana found himself dragged into something bigger than the outfit. Congress had begun investigating CIA activities in the wake of Watergate, uncovering a trail of covert plots, coups, and assassinations. Buried in those files were the CIA's attempts to kill Fidel Castro, and at the center of those attempts, the name Sam Giancana appeared again and again. The government that once whispered to him in hotel rooms was now ready to parade him under oath. The irony was sharp. For years, he had mocked the FBI tails outside his house, laughed at wiretaps, dismissed subpoenas. Now he was being asked not about gambling, not about skimming, not even about Chicago politics, but about the CIA itself. Did the agency really recruit the mob to assassinate Castro? Did he, Sam Giancana, sit across from government agents with poison pills on the table? The questions weren't just about crime anymore. They were about history, about the hidden face of American power. Giancana hated it. To him, loyalty was law. You didn't talk. You didn't confirm. You didn't betray the shadows you had lived in. But Congress was relentless, and subpoenas weren't suggestions. He was trapped. To testify meant exposing secrets that tied him to Washington. To refuse meant contempt charges, prison, perhaps worse. And all the while, he knew the outfit was watching closely. They didn't care about the CIA's plots. They cared about his mouth. If he said too much about Havana, about Vegas, about Chicago, his exile might end not in a courtroom, but in a coffin. The FBI played their part with quiet satisfaction. They had chased him for years, filled cabinets with wiretaps and reports, and now they had him back in their grasp. But even they knew the danger. A man like Giancana carried too many secrets, too many names, too much history. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was a man who could, with a few sentences, confirm that America's war against Castro had been fought not just by soldiers and spies, but by mobsters with grudges. Reporters swarmed around him, hungry for a soundbite. Some called him the celebrity gangster again, trying to revive the myth of Mooney the Charmer. But the myth had cracks. The cameras caught something else too: the weariness, the paranoia, the sense of a man who had lived too long with enemies circling. Behind every smile was fear. Behind every word was calculation. And behind every calculation was the gnawing realization that he was running out of moves. In private, Giancana must have replayed the contradictions that now defined his life. The Kennedys had used him, then turned against him. The CIA had courted him, then abandoned him. The outfit had raised him, then forced him out. Now, each of those worlds threatened him in different ways: politics, espionage, crime. He had lived at the intersection of them all, and now, at 66, the intersection was collapsing. Congressional investigators prepared their questions. The FBI prepared their files. The outfit prepared their silence. And Giancana, sitting once again in his Oak Park home, must have felt the walls closing tighter than ever. He was back in the city he had once ruled, but it no longer felt like his. The agents still parked on the street. The reporters still camped outside. The whispers still circled in backrooms. Only now, the stakes were higher. He wasn't just Mooney anymore. He was a man with the power to confirm or deny the darkest secrets of both the mob and the government. Every phone call he took, every knock on the door, carried weight. Did the CIA fear what he might say? Did the outfit? Did Washington? Or was it all the same thing now? A tangle of interests ready to cut him loose if he became too dangerous? For Giancana, it must have felt like playing a game of cards where every hand was stacked against him. He had once believed he could bluff his way through anything. But this was different. This wasn't Chicago. This was history itself, pulling him toward a stage he didn't want to stand on. And yet, there was no escape. The subpoenas were real. The hearings were set. His name was on the list. Sam Giancana, mob boss of Chicago, would be asked to testify about CIA murder plots against a foreign leader. A gangster dragged into the spotlight of American politics once again, not as kingmaker, but as a witness. The irony was almost unbearable. The boy who once carried stolen bread through Little Italy was now expected to carry the secrets of two nations on his shoulders. He had always craved attention, always embraced the spotlight. But this spotlight wasn't glamorous. It was lethal. And as he sat in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he would one day meet his violent end, Sam Giancana must have realized that this time, there would be no escaping the heat. The hearings were coming. The questions were waiting. And in Chicago, the outfit had already begun to decide whether Mooney would live long enough to answer them. The room was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that presses down, heavy with expectation, the kind that makes even the sound of a cough feel like an interruption. Cameras lined the walls, their lenses glinting under fluorescent lights. Reporters scribbled in notepads, pins scratching like insects in the background. At the center of it all, sitting before the senators, was Sam Giancana. The mob boss, the exile, the man whose name had haunted both Chicago streets and Washington corridors, was now called to answer questions not about gambling or unions, but about the CIA, about assassination plots, about secrets no one wanted spoken out loud. The Church Committee hearings of 1975 were supposed to rip the veil off America's hidden wars. The senators wanted answers about the CIA's darkest experiments, covert coups, wiretaps on citizens, plans to assassinate foreign leaders. And in that sweep of investigation, one name stood out as proof of how deep the shadows ran: Sam Giancana. The mob had not only crossed paths with the government, they had worked together. Poison pills, Havana contacts, whispered promises of Havana casinos restored once Castro was dead. All of it tied back to him. He sat there, older now, the years of exile showing in his face, but his presence still commanding. For a moment, he looked every bit the man who had once brushed shoulders with Sinatra, Kennedy, and Hollywood stars. But the myth couldn't shield him here. In this room, under these lights, he wasn't Mooney the celebrity gangster. He was a witness under oath, a man expected to confirm or deny one of the most explosive secrets in American history. The senators leaned forward. The questions were sharp, their voices cutting through the silence. Did he meet with CIA operatives? Did he conspire to kill Fidel Castro? Did the government really ask a mob boss to do its dirty work? Each question was meant to slice into the myth, to drag the shadows into daylight. But Giancana only smirked, only leaned back, only gave the answers he had always given. He knew the code. You don't talk. You don't confess. You don't betray the silence. He refused to cooperate. Time and again, he dodged, deflected, invoked the Fifth Amendment. To the public, it looked like arrogance. To the senators, it was infuriating. But to the mob, it was survival. Silence was the only currency that mattered. To talk was to die. To remain silent was to keep a shred of control, even if it meant contempt in the eyes of the government. The code of silence, omerta, wasn't just a rule. It was a shield, forged in decades of blood. It meant loyalty even under pressure, dignity even in defeat. And in that Senate chamber, Sam Giancana clung to it as though it were the last thing he had left. He had already lost Chicago, lost Havana, lost the Kennedys. But he would not lose the code. Not here. Not to them. Yet behind the bravado, fear must have crept in. He wasn't a fool. He knew what his silence looked like. To the senators, it was defiance. To the CIA, it was dangerous. To the outfit, it was a gamble. If he didn't talk, maybe he kept their secrets safe. But what if the senators dragged him back again? What if the pressure became too much? What if, one day, he decided to break? The fear wasn't just his. It belonged to every man whose name might slip from his lips if the silence ever cracked. Reporters described the hearing as a stalemate. Senators frustrated, Giancana stone-faced, the truth still buried. But outside that room, the fallout was already spreading. The outfit was watching. The CIA was listening. Everyone knew that Giancana, sitting there in front of the world, carried enough secrets to shatter lives, to destroy careers, to bring down institutions. The danger wasn't what he said that day. It was what he might say tomorrow. In private, he must have felt the trap closing. The hearings had painted him into a corner. He was too public now, too visible, Every move he made was scrutinized. Every phone call was noted. Every visit was observed. And within the outfit, his name was once again a problem, a reminder that sometimes, even silence makes too much noise. He had dreamed of being untouchable, of being more than a gangster. But sitting before those senators, he must have realized the cruel irony. He was untouchable no longer. He was a pawn, moved between governments and gangsters, each side waiting to see what he would do next. And pawns, no matter how flashy, rarely survive the endgame. The hearings adjourned, the cameras packed up, the senators moved on to the next witness. For the public, it was just another day of testimony, another mobster refusing to break. But for Giancana, it was a warning. He had been dragged into daylight, forced to sit in the crosshairs of politics and crime. And both sides had noticed. The silence he clung to that day may have saved him in the room. But outside, in the streets of Chicago, in the corridors of Washington, and in the whispered conversations of men who no longer trusted him, that silence was beginning to sound like a threat. The committee wanted more. The FBI wanted more. The outfit wanted less. And Sam Giancana, walking out of the Senate chamber under a haze of flashbulbs, must have known in his bones that his time was running out. The code had protected him for decades. But now, it might be the very thing that killed him. The kitchen in Oak Park was quiet now, too quiet for a man who had once commanded rooms filled with laughter, music, and the hum of money flowing like electricity. Sam Giancana sat at his table, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, the tick of the clock louder than it had ever seemed before. He was still wealthy, still able to eat steak for breakfast and pour top-shelf bourbon without glancing at the label. But wealth wasn't the same as power. Power was gone. The men who once lined up to kiss his ring now avoided his calls. The outfit he had ruled like a king had stripped him of his throne. Coming back to Oak Park after years in exile was not a return to glory. It was a return to isolation. The agents were still outside, parked down the street, watching. Reporters still hovered, waiting for him to slip. But the faces that mattered, the old allies, the lieutenants, even Sinatra's crowd, were gone. Some were dead, some retired, some simply unwilling to be tied to Mooney anymore. The charisma that once drew people and now repelled them. He had become radioactive, a man whose name meant trouble to anyone still trying to survive in the mob's shadows. He still tried to play the role. He wore the tailored suits, smiled at the neighbors, waved at the agents sitting in their cars. He ordered fine food, entertained a few loyal friends who still dared to visit. But each dinner was smaller, each laugh thinner, each night ending earlier. His house, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a cage. The fences and hedges that shielded him from curious eyes couldn't shield him from the truth. He was alone. Paranoia seeped deeper with each passing week. Giancana had lived with enemies his whole life, but now he sensed them everywhere. In the shadows of the trees at night, in the whispers of men at bars, in the long pauses on the other end of phone calls. He had once thrived on paranoia, using it as fuel to outthink and outmaneuver rivals. But now it consumed him. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was fear. The outfit tolerated his presence, but did not welcome it. Accardo and Ricca had made their decision years earlier. Sam's return didn't change that. His exile had stripped him of authority, and no one was rushing to hand it back. In Chicago's underworld, memory was short when it came to loyalty and long when it came to mistakes. Mooney had made too many, but he still carried weight, dangerous weight. He knew secrets no one wanted aired. About Havana, about Vegas, about the Kennedys, about the CIA. Secrets he had refused to share with the Senate, but secrets that still existed, still haunted the men who had lived them. To his enemies, his silence was not reassuring. It was terrifying. What if one day he decided to talk? What if he broke the code? What if his pride cracked under pressure? The irony was brutal. Silence had kept him alive in the Senate chamber, but silence in Oak Park made him a target. Because silence isn't absence, it's potential. And potential makes men nervous. Still, in his own mind, Giancana wasn't finished. He told himself he could come back, that the outfit would need him again. He boasted to the few friends who still visited that he was still Mooney, still the man who had shaped presidents and built empires. But the bravado rang hollow. Behind the words was an old man, tired, isolated, haunted by the ghosts of Havana, Hollywood, and Washington. His nights grew longer, filled with bourbon and cigarettes, his mind replaying old triumphs like worn film reels. The nightclubs, the casinos, the women, the politicians, images of a world that had slipped through his fingers. Now, the only sound in his house was the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, and the occasional knock at the door. And each knock carried the same question: friend or enemy? Sam Giancana was back in Chicago, but he was no longer in control of it. He was back in his house, but it no longer felt like home. He was surrounded by wealth, but starved of power. His legends still loomed, but legends don't protect against knives in the dark. The circle around him grew tighter with each passing day. Friends, enemies, the government, the outfit, everyone waited to see what Sam would do next. And Sam, for the first time in his life, had no clear move left. The silence that had once defined his strength now pressed in on him like a vice. And somewhere in that silence, death was already on its way. The smell of sausage filled the basement kitchen. It was ordinary, almost comforting, the kind of smell that belonged to Sunday mornings and family dinners, not to a man whose life had been defined by violence, politics, and betrayal. Sam Giancana stood at the stove, a frying pan in his hand, the sizzle of meat echoing against the tiled walls. It was June 19th, 1975, and after decades of running empires and surviving enemies, the end came not in a smoky backroom or on a Vegas strip, but here, in his own home, doing something as simple as cooking. The house in Oak Park was quiet that night. No guards at the door. No crowd of visitors. Just Giancana alone. Moving through the basement kitchen he often used to avoid the formality of the upstairs rooms. He liked the routine of it, the privacy. But privacy cuts both ways. Privacy is where enemies find you. The killer entered with no struggle, no warning, no broken locks or shattered windows. That was the mark of familiarity. Whoever walked into that basement wasn't a stranger. In Giancana's world, the man who comes to kill you is often a man you once trusted. A handshake partner. A friend who knew where the spare key was kept. Trust, in the outfit, was often the first step toward betrayal. The shot came from a .22 pistol fitted with a suppressor. Small caliber, but in the hands of a professional, it was the perfect weapon. Quiet. Precise. 7 shots in all, 1 in the back of the head, 6 more in the face and neck as he fell. Overkill. A message. Whoever ordered it didn't want doubt. They wanted certainty. They wanted the world to know that Sam Giancana, once untouchable, was now silenced forever. The pan clattered to the floor. The sausage sizzled until the flame beneath it died. On the tiled floor of his basement, Mooney lay in a pool of blood, the smoke of his final meal curling into the air like incense at the altar of his own downfall. Neighbors heard nothing. No shouting. No break-in. Just silence, broken only when the body was discovered hours later. A man who had survived bullets, betrayal, and the FBI's relentless chase was gone in an instant. And the manner of it, the domestic normalcy of the setting, the brutality of the execution, only deepened the shock. Theories bloomed immediately. Was it the outfit, tying up loose ends before Giancana could say too much to Congress about CIA plots? Was it the CIA itself, silencing a partner turned liability? Or was it a mixture of both, an unholy alliance of crime and government, ensuring that Mooney never had the chance to speak what he knew? Each theory carried weight, and none could be dismissed. What is certain is that his death carried the precision of a professional hit. No robbery, no witnesses, no noise. Just 7 bullets, methodical and cold. In the language of the underworld, this wasn't just murder. It was punctuation, an ending written in gunpowder and blood. The irony was merciless. Just weeks earlier, Giancana had been preparing to testify before the Senate's Church Committee about CIA assassination plots. He had dodged questions before, refused to break omerta, but the government wanted him back in the chair. They wanted answers about Castro, about poison pills, about the secret marriage of spies and mobsters. And then, before he could say another word, he was dead. The timing was too neat to ignore. Silence, once again, had been enforced. For the outfit, his death eliminated a liability. Mooney had become too loud, too reckless, too dangerous. He knew too much, and his pride made him unpredictable. In their world, unpredictability was death. For the CIA, if they had a hand in it, the motive was even clearer. Giancana was a man who lived in shadows but loved the spotlight. Sooner or later, he might have revealed too much. Silence was safer. His family, his friends, even the men who had once feared him were left with the same unanswered questions. Who pulled the trigger? Who gave the order? Who decided that June night would be the end? The FBI investigated, of course, but no one was charged. In the mob, in politics, in espionage alike, some murders are never meant to be solved. The scene in that basement lingered in memory like a grim painting. The frying pan on the stove, the sausage half-cooked, the old man lying in his own blood. It stripped away the glamour, the legend, the Sinatra nights and Havana casinos, the CIA briefcases and whispered deals with presidents. It reduced Sam Giancana to what every gangster, every man, ultimately becomes: mortal, vulnerable, alone in the end. And yet, the legend only grew. His death cemented the mystery. To this day, debates rage about who really killed him, about what secrets he might have carried to the grave. Was he silenced for knowing too much? Was it revenge from within the outfit? Or was it simply the inevitable fate of every man who plays too close to both sides, believing himself untouchable? 7 bullets answered the question of his survival, but they opened 100 more about his life. And as the years passed, one truth remained. Sam Giancana's assassination wasn't just the end of a man. It was the closing of a chapter in American history where gangsters, politicians, and spies danced together in the dark, and one by one, the dancers began to fall. The smell of sausage lingered in that basement long after the body was carried away. A final reminder that no matter how high a man rises, the end often comes not in grandeur, but in silence. And somewhere, in the shadows, the man who pulled the trigger walked away unnoticed, carrying with him the certainty that Mooney's secrets had been buried not with his words, but with his blood. The basement was barely cold when the questions began. 7 bullets had silenced Sam Giancana, but in many ways, his murder spoke louder than his life ever had. The official story was simple: a mob boss, fallen from power, executed in classic outfit style. But nothing about Giancana was ever simple. His life had brushed against presidents, movie stars, and spies. And so his death, sudden, brutal, and timed just before he was set to testify about CIA assassination plots, sparked conspiracies that have never stopped swirling. One theory was immediate, almost obvious. The outfit had turned on him. It fit the mob's code. Giancana had become a liability. Too much heat from the FBI, too much attention from Congress, too many secrets he might spill. He was isolated, stripped of leadership, tolerated but not trusted. In the outfit, loyalty was measured by profit and silence. And if a man could no longer guarantee either, his life was no longer useful. The execution was clean, efficient, professional. Exactly what Chicago had perfected for decades. To many, it looked like the most natural ending for Mooney, taken out by the very machine he once commanded. But others saw something darker, something beyond the reach of Chicago alleys. The CIA had reason to fear him, too. In 1975, Giancana was on the witness list for the Senate's Church Committee, which was peeling back the layers of America's secret wars. His name was tied directly to the Castro plots, the poison pills, the Havana contacts, the strange alliance of gangsters and spies. If Giancana talked, if he confirmed that the CIA had conspired with the mob to assassinate a foreign leader, it would be a scandal of historic proportions. For some, the timing of his death was too perfect, too neat. He was silenced not by the outfit, but by operatives with government ties who couldn't risk his testimony. The two theories aren't mutually exclusive. Some suggest it was both, the outfit and the CIA, their interests suddenly aligned. The mob wanted him gone before he could talk. The CIA wanted him gone before senators asked the wrong questions. In that overlap, a silent deal was struck. The same shadow marriage that had tied spies and gangsters together against Castro may have ended in a final, unspoken agreement. Mooney dies, and everyone's secrets stay buried. Even the manner of his death feeds the mystery. The use of a .22 with a silencer was unusual for the outfit, which often preferred louder, cruder statements. The overkill, 7 shots, including a cluster to the face, felt like a message. But whose message? To some, it was mob-style punctuation, the outfit ensuring there was no mistaking the fate of traitors. To others, it was spycraft, an execution designed for silence, done with precision, leaving nothing but questions in its wake. In Oak Park, neighbors whispered that Giancana had trusted the man who killed him. No break-in, no sign of struggle. Whoever pulled the trigger was let inside. That detail haunts the story. Was it an old ally, a man sent by Chicago bosses who knew Sam would open the door without suspicion? Or was it someone carrying government credentials, someone Mooney believed came with orders to protect, not destroy? The betrayal cut deepest in that unanswered question. The conspiracy theories expanded with time. Some believed his death was tied to the Kennedys. Giancana had allegedly helped deliver votes for John F. Kennedy in 1960. He had rumored ties to both John and Robert through Marilyn Monroe. He had been both ally and enemy, courted and hunted by the same family. Did his death close a chapter too dangerous to leave open? Was it revenge, cleanup, or simply coincidence? To this day, the whispers won't die. Others speculated about foreign hands. Giancana's reach extended into Latin America and Europe, touching smuggling routes and international rackets. Could rivals abroad have feared what he might reveal under oath? Could Havana, the city he once dreamed of reclaiming, have reached back to settle old scores? Theories piled like bodies, each one plausible, none provable. For investigators, the case was maddening. The FBI scoured the scene. Congress raised questions. But the deeper they dug, the murkier it became. Witnesses refused to talk. Evidence was thin. And the very institutions supposed to investigate, the FBI, the CIA, even the outfit's political connections, were themselves entangled in the shadows Giancana carried. It was as if no one truly wanted the truth. They wanted only silence, the same silence Mooney had carried to his grave. For his family, the murder was a wound with no closure. They buried a man who had lived larger than life, but they buried him with questions that hung in the air like smoke. For his enemies, the murder was relief. The problem was solved, the liability erased. For the public, it was spectacle, the fall of a gangster who had danced too close to presidents and spies, ending in blood on his basement floor. But for history, his death is a crack in the mirror of America's past. It reflects something uncomfortable, something unsaid, that in the mid-20th century, the lines between organized crime and government weren't just blurred. They were crossed. And sometimes, when the stakes were high enough, men like Sam Giancana weren't just hunted by the law, they were used by it, and then discarded. The conspiracies surrounding his death endure because they tap into that deeper truth. People believe the outfit killed him because that's how mob stories usually end. People believe the CIA killed him because his life was no ordinary mob story. Both versions feel right. Both versions feel incomplete. And in that gap, the mystery survives. What no one doubts is that Giancana's murder was not random. It was calculated, deliberate, inevitable. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a street corner shootout. It was an execution. A full stop at the end of a sentence too dangerous to continue. 7 bullets silenced him. But the echoes remain. To this day, the question lingers. Was Sam Giancana killed by the outfit he once ruled, by the government he once served, or by both? Bound in a conspiracy too deep to ever surface? And the silence that followed his death suggests the answer may have been all of the above. The sound of gunfire in that Oak Park basement was supposed to be an ending, but in truth, it became the beginning of something else. Death froze Sam Giancana in place, not just as a mob boss, but as a figure woven into America's most unsettling intersections, where organized crime brushed against politics, where spies whispered in smoky backrooms with killers, where Hollywood and Washington blurred into the same stage. He died as a man, but he lived on as a shadow, a reminder that the borders between power and corruption are far thinner than anyone wants to admit. Giancana's legacy is not measured only in the millions skimmed from casinos or the rackets he controlled from Chicago to Las Vegas. It is measured in the way his life forces questions that never quite find answers. How much influence did he really have over the Kennedy election in 1960? How deep did his relationship with the CIA run during the Castro plots? Was Marilyn Monroe simply another name in his parade of lovers? Or was she a thread connecting him to the most powerful family in America? Each story about him is part fact, part myth, stitched together in a way that makes the truth harder to see. But that difficulty, that blur, is the essence of his legacy. To the outfit, he was both triumph and warning. Under his reign, Chicago reached unprecedented heights of influence, stretching its hands into unions, Hollywood, Havana, and Vegas. He proved that a mob boss could stand on the global stage, mingling with stars and spies alike. But he also proved the dangers of ego, of stepping too far into the light. His flamboyance drew attention, and attention is the one thing the outfit cannot survive. In the years after his fall, the bosses who followed returned to shadows, quieter, more careful, learning from his mistakes. To Washington, his name is a haunting footnote. His connections to CIA assassination plots remain one of the strangest marriages in American history, the law and the outlaw shaking hands for a shared enemy. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how governments wield power, about whether morality bends when survival is at stake. Giancana was a gangster, but in those moments, he was also an instrument of the state. That contradiction remains unresolved, a ghost lingering in declassified documents and whispered histories. To Hollywood, he remains the archetype of the celebrity gangster. He had Sinatra at his side, Rat Pack stars in his orbit, actresses on his arm. He lived as if crime and glamour belonged in the same breath, and for a while, they did. The glitz of Las Vegas, the lights of Hollywood, the charisma of political campaigns, all of them intersected with a mob boss from Little Italy who never finished school but ended up rubbing shoulders with the elite. He embodied the allure of outlaw charisma, the dangerous magnetism of a man who could terrify you and charm you in the same glance. But his story is not only about allure. It is also about isolation. His final days show the cost of playing all sides. By the end, he was a man surrounded not by allies, but by eyes, FBI agents in cars down the street, CIA officials flipping through files, outfit bosses waiting for his next mistake. He had walked too close to too many fires, and eventually, he burned. That is his warning. That is the thread running beneath the glamour. Power borrowed from too many places is power that cannot last. Even in death, the questions multiply. Who pulled the trigger? Was it the outfit, ensuring silence? Was it the CIA, erasing a liability? Was it both, bound together in a final act of convenience? These questions ensure Giancana is never just remembered as another mobster. They place him in the pantheon of American enigmas, alongside unsolved assassinations and conspiracies that still divide public opinion. His death is not just a crime scene. It is a riddle, one that has never been solved. And perhaps that is the heart of his legacy. Giancana represents the gray space, the twilight zone where crime, politics, and intelligence blur into one another. He shows us a world where presidents borrow favors from gangsters, where spies lean on killers for help, where movie stars dine with men whose hands are stained with blood. He forces us to look at the myth of separate worlds and see the cracks. He reminds us that history is not neat, not clean, not easily divided between good and evil. It is messy. It is compromised. It is shadowed. The young boy who once hustled on the streets of Chicago's Little Italy became a man who sat in Havana casinos with mob bosses, whispered with CIA agents about assassinations, and mingled in Hollywood parties with some of the most famous faces of the 20th century. And yet, he died alone, cooking sausage in a basement kitchen. That contrast between the vastness of his reach and the smallness of his end, is part of why his story endures. He is remembered not as Capone was, a brute of the streets, nor as Gotti was, a tabloid star of open defiance. He is remembered as something in between, a figure who lived in the overlap, a shadow boss, a man who never quite belonged entirely to the mob, or to politics, or to espionage, but who moved between them all, leaving a trail of mystery. In the end, his silence was louder than his words. He refused to cooperate with Senate hearings. He refused to betray the code. And yet, that silence is what made him most dangerous, because silence leaves room for speculation. And speculation ensures the story never dies. Sam Giancana remains a riddle in American history. Was he a mob boss who overreached, or a political tool discarded when he became inconvenient? Was he a man who controlled history, or a man used by it? Was he killed for what he did, or for what he might have said? The answers may never come, but perhaps that is the point. His legacy is not in clarity. It is in the shadows he left behind. Shadows that force us to wonder, to question, to peer into the dark corners of history where truth and myth are almost indistinguishable. Sam Giancana walked with presidents, with spies, with movie stars. And yet, his footsteps ended in silence, in a basement kitchen, in the final act of a story that was always destined to blur the line between power and crime. And as the years pass, one truth remains. Sam Giancana was not just a gangster. He was a symbol of how deeply the shadows can touch the light.